Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The corridor greeted me like a gaping maw in the dim glow of the emergency light. Its silence was so thick that it felt alive, wrapping itself around every footstep, every ragged breath. I could almost taste the stale air on my tongue, a stagnant flavor of dust and something vaguely metallic. My heart thudded in my chest the moment I set foot on my floor, as if my body already knew something was wrong, even before I remembered why. I've lived in this condominium for over a year. It's a quiet place, generally well-maintained, with neighbors who exchange polite nods in the elevator and occasional friendly banter in the lobby. But the hallway on my floor is notorious for being poorly lit. One of the bulbs in the overhead fixture is perpetually flickering, and the other never seems bright enough. Everyone complains about it in passing, yet nobody ever does more than file a request with the building manager. For the most part, people assume it's just part of the building's quirks. Late one evening, I got home from work, exhausted after a day that felt interminable. My feet were dragging by the time I stepped out of the elevator. The overhead light in the corridor sputtered weakly, bathing the walls in an anemic glow. The hush around me felt heavier than usual, pressing in on my ears. I stepped forward, heading toward my apartment door, when I felt something brush against my shoulder, a quick light shove that sent me stumbling sideways into the wall. My breath caught in my throat as I instinctively whirled around. The corridor was empty. The elevator doors had closed behind me. There was no sign of any neighbor in a rush or even a drifting shadow that might have offered an explanation. That was the first time I experienced the push. My hand flew to my chest, heart hammering against my ribs, mouth going instantly dry. The corridor's silence felt mocking, as if it were daring me to challenge it. My pulse wouldn't slow, and even though I told myself there had to be some rational cause, maybe I'd lost my balance, maybe my mind was playing tricks, the sense of being pushed lingered. A moment later, I forced myself to walk, continuing to my door with rapid steps. My fingers trembled so badly that I had to attempt unlocking it 3 times before the key fit. Once inside, I turned on every light in my living room, hoping to chase away the knot of dread coiling in my stomach. I tried to sleep that night but kept replaying the incident in my head. The press of a palm on my shoulder felt too real to be my imagination. Every time I drifted off, I dreamed of that corridor, an indistinct shape darting just behind me, always gone before I could fully turn around. By morning, I was exhausted, a damp sheen of sweat covering my forehead. Over coffee, I typed a brief message on the building's group chat. I asked if anyone else had experienced the sensation of someone rushing past them in the hallway, specifically on our floor. Almost immediately, I got several replies. A woman from 2 doors down wrote that she had felt a gust of air swoosh by her one night, cold against her neck, even though no window was open. Another neighbor privately messaged me that once, after midnight, he thought he glimpsed a figure at the far end of the corridor that vanished the second he blinked. Neither of them heard anything, nor saw any clear silhouette, yet the encounters were eerily similar. Some people teased that it was probably just a draft or an overactive imagination, but their half-joking responses didn't comfort me. Instead, it made me realize how many of us had felt something off about that place. A few days passed without incident, and I nearly convinced myself that nothing was wrong, that I had let exhaustion get the better of me. But the very next week, as I was returning home later than usual, the corridor was a study in shadows, with the lights flickering more aggressively than before. My breath came in short gasps as I advanced, the back of my neck prickling under the intangible weight of being watched. My key was in hand this time, ready to insert into the lock as soon as I arrived at my door. Then, just as I reached the midpoint of the hallway, the temperature seemed to drop. A clammy chill ran over my skin. My heart pounded so violently that I could feel it in my ears. This time there wasn't a push, but I heard something. A low hiss or maybe a soft rush of air right behind my ear. It was enough to send me stumbling forward, my legs turning to jelly. I nearly dropped my key as I fumbled to open my door. When I stepped inside, I slammed it shut, leaning against the wood as I fought to catch my breath. I felt my pulse in every inch of my body. I thought about calling the doorman or maybe letting building security know about a possible intruder. But who would believe me if I reported an unseen presence that left no trace except for rattled nerves? In the days that followed, the group chat erupted. One neighbor mentioned hearing faint footsteps pacing the hallway at odd hours, though whenever he looked through the peephole, he saw nothing. Another neighbor wrote about seeing the overhead lights switch off by themselves, plunging the corridor into near-complete darkness for a few seconds at a time. The building manager insisted that the wiring was old and needed replacing, and that an electrician would be scheduled. Yet the repairs kept getting delayed. The stories continued accumulating. People began avoiding that hallway late at night if they could help it, some even taking the stairs from the floor below or above to bypass the corridor altogether. I tried to carry on normally, but my nerves were on edge. Mornings weren't so bad. The corridor still had its usual gloom, but the daylight streaming in from a small window at the far end provided some relief. My biggest anxiety built up toward the end of the day, when I knew I'd have to pass through that same space in darkness. The second I stepped out of the elevator, I'd feel a tension knotting in my shoulders, my body bracing for something I couldn't name. One night, I decided I had to gather proof of whatever was happening. I tucked my phone in my hand, camera ready, determined to record any bizarre occurrence. I left a friend's place around 11 and arrived at the building close to midnight. The corridor was pitch dark, except for a single malfunctioning bulb. I raised my phone and started filming as I walked, heart beating like a war drum in my chest. The corridor's hush had a thickness, as if the air itself were turning to fog. Each step felt heavier than the last, my legs trembling with adrenaline-fueled dread. My breath sounded too loud, echoing in my ears, but I tried to keep the camera steady. About halfway down, my phone's flashlight cut out for a second. Maybe a technical glitch, maybe nerves that made me loosen my grip. The darkness pressed in, enveloping me so completely that I lost all sense of direction. My heart pounded so forcefully it hurt. Then, the phone's light flicked back on. In that split second of regained visibility, I caught sight of something at the edge of the screen. An outline that seemed to flit across the corridor, out of frame too quickly for me to register any details. Instantly, the phone slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a crack. I gasped, stooping to pick it up. I turned on the camera playback right there in the hallway, too terrified to move forward without some validation. My mouth went bone dry as I watched the footage. For a fraction of a second, I saw a shape. It was indistinct, elongated, and unnervingly tall. Then it disappeared into the shadows. No eyes, no face, just a suggestion of a figure. My blood turned to ice, and my breath came in ragged gulps. I forced myself to finish the walk to my apartment, phone clutched so tightly that my knuckles ached. The next morning, I tried to show the video to one of the neighbors who had also reported strange incidents. He squinted at the screen, leaning forward with palpable tension. In a shaky voice, he admitted he saw a faint movement in the corner of the frame, but it wasn't clear enough to prove anything. He suggested we might be scaring ourselves over a glitch or a shadow caused by the flickering light. Yet he couldn't fully hide the apprehension in his expression. Over the next few nights, my paranoia skyrocketed. I started hearing sounds inside my apartment, a soft rustling in the living room when I was in the bedroom, or a faint tapping on the walls. I'd jump out of bed, heart in my throat, only to find nothing but stillness. Sleep became a battle, my mind looping on the same question. Was something from that corridor following me? The possibility made my skin crawl. I caught myself looking over my shoulder even in my own rooms, checking behind doors, under the couch, opening closets just to confirm they were empty. Every time the building's group chat notifications popped up, my stomach churned, expecting more unsettling news. It wasn't just me. Other residents on the same floor reported that they felt uneasy at home, as if the walls themselves were breathing. One person mentioned an oppressive heaviness in the air, especially near the entrance to his unit. Another said she could have sworn she heard whispering in the hallway when nobody was around. The general consensus was that something was off, yet no one could agree on what to do. Some recommended blessings or having someone cleanse the corridor. Others laughed it off as a mass hallucination. Meanwhile, the flickering light problem remained unresolved. Maintenance kept claiming supply shortages or scheduling conflicts. It was hard not to suspect that they just didn't want to deal with that space at night. I hit my breaking point when I woke up one morning to find muddy footprints near my apartment door. They trailed for about 3 steps, then vanished abruptly. The pattern looked too large to be mine. My own shoes were clean, and I hadn't noticed any neighbor tracking dirt. Shaken, I snapped photos and wiped the area clean. I shared the images with the group chat, and the conversation exploded. A few neighbors admitted they had found unexplained footprints as well, although their markings were slightly different in size or shape. We collectively demanded a thorough investigation, but security insisted they had no relevant footage. The cameras in the hallway apparently malfunctioned, capturing static during the exact hours in question. From that day on, my entire perspective shifted. It wasn't just about the corridor's flickering lights and odd sensations. It was the creeping realization that something unexplainable lurked there, defying every rational explanation we tried to give it. My senses felt sharper, yet also on the brink of overload. I kept expecting to see that flickering shape from the video out of the corner of my eye whenever I walked past any dimly lit area. One evening, I mustered the courage to confront this presence directly. It wasn't a decision I arrived at easily, but I was desperate for a resolution, or at least some clarity. Armed with a strong flashlight and my phone, I chose to stay out later than usual so I could return at a time I suspected it would appear, somewhere around midnight, based on the pattern of reports. When I reached my floor, the corridor was darker than ever, the overhead light completely dead. My pulse drummed a fierce, erratic rhythm under my skin. I turned on the flashlight, its beam sweeping over the walls, the floor, the closed doors of the neighbors' apartments. The silence in that hallway was deafening. It felt like stepping into a vacuum, where even my breathing was too loud. Every step I took echoed faintly, making it seem like there were 2 sets of footsteps. My nerves were a live wire, goosebumps prickling on my arms. Then, about 3/4 of the way down the corridor, I felt the air shift. It was a subtle change in pressure, almost as if something huge was passing by. My flashlight flickered wildly, though the batteries were fresh. A second later, I sensed a presence just off to my right, near the wall. I whipped the beam of light over, adrenaline surging in my veins. My body was shaking, mouth parched, heart thrumming so hard I was certain it would burst. In that split second, I saw a ripple in the shadows, like dark fabric billowing in a gust of wind that I couldn't feel. My eyes watered from the intensity of the moment. It was there, yet it wasn't. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet remained glued in place. I mentally recited every logical explanation I could. A trick of the light, a sleep-deprived mind feeding on fear, an illusion cast by the corridor's angles. None of that calmed the raw panic pulsing through me. Without warning, I felt a tug at my sleeve, hard enough to jerk my arm backward. I staggered, knees buckling. A strangled sound escaped my throat. My flashlight fell, spinning on the floor, its beam tracing dizzying arcs on the walls. I let out a guttural cry and lunged for the flashlight, gripping it like a lifeline. There was nothing there except the swirl of shadows. My breathing was rapid and shallow, sweat drenching my forehead, my shirt sticking to my back. I scrambled to my apartment door, half convinced I'd feel another violent pull at any second. Fumbling with shaking hands, I got inside and slammed the door shut, chest heaving. That night I realized the corridor held a power, something beyond my comprehension. I had confronted it and survived, but the experience left me drained, my sense of safety obliterated. Over the following days, I noticed that the hallway's overhead light was finally replaced. The flicker was gone. The building manager assured everyone that the electrical issues had been fixed. Oddly, the frantic messages in the group chat subsided, as if an unspoken agreement hovered. We wouldn't talk about that corridor anymore. It was too unnerving, too impossible to explain. But for me, the real shift happened inside. Every time I step out of the elevator now, I brace myself. Even though the corridor looks normal and the lights no longer flicker, I still feel that pressure against my shoulder sometimes, a phantom touch that makes me recoil. My nights remain restless. I keep expecting the atmosphere to thicken, to swirl with hidden movement. Sometimes I think I hear faint rustling on the other side of my front door in the late hours, but I no longer open it to check. I haven't moved out, not yet. Part of me wonders if I'm overreacting. Another part of me is convinced that whatever lurked in that hallway may still be there, biding its time, hiding in the corners of my vision. The corridor might look bright now, its light unwavering, but I can't forget the sensation of that push and the near suffocating silence that haunted every inch of that space. There's an itch at the back of my mind that won't go away, a persistent sense of being observed. The tension never fully dissipated. It merely receded beneath the surface, ready to erupt if given the chance. Although I have no proof that anything truly supernatural is in that corridor, my gut screams otherwise. And every single night when I pass through, I walk just a little faster, heart hammering against my ribs, ears straining for the faintest sound. I'm convinced that one day I'll feel that invisible nudge again, and this time I won't be the only one to notice. Until then, I live with the uneasy certainty that some door, better left closed, has been nudged open, and whatever managed to slip through might still be right beside me, hidden in the hush of the hallway. From the moment I first laid eyes on the painting, an unsettling chill traveled across my skin. It wasn't merely the subject, a tall man in a slightly battered fedora against a gray, misty background. It was the way his eyes seemed to have a life of their own. I remember standing in the silent auction hall, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, feeling as if the man in the painting was quietly surveying every passerby. The hush in that room seemed to grow heavier around his presence. My pulse quickened even before I placed my bid. Something inexplicable pushed me to bring that picture home, as if I couldn't leave it behind. I felt an urgent compulsion to own it, to discover what mysteries it held. And so, I bought it, believing it would be nothing more than a captivating conversation piece. I realize now how wrong I was. I set the painting in my living room, propping it against the wall above an old wooden sideboard. I felt oddly proud to display it, imagining how it would add a vintage flair to my otherwise simple decor. The overhead lamp cast an uneven glow across the canvas, highlighting the man's narrowed eyes, the downward set of his thin lips, and the shadows beneath his cheekbones. Though the room was quiet, I remember that my heartbeat sounded disproportionately loud to my ears. A faint wave of nausea fluttered in my stomach as I stepped back, scrutinizing the painting from different angles. Each time I got that same impression. He was looking right at me. Yet I told myself it was just the style of old oil paintings, how the artists of certain eras had a knack for making the eyes follow the viewer. I shrugged off my discomfort. The first few days passed without significant incident, but I never grew fully comfortable in my own living room. I found myself sitting in the far corner of the couch, angled in such a way as to avoid meeting those eyes. Sometimes late at night I would catch myself glancing in the painting's direction. The man's expression, stagnant on the canvas, gave me the feeling he was aware of my scrutiny. My chest would tighten at the thought, and I'd force my attention elsewhere. As time went by, I began to notice that friends and acquaintances who visited commented in hushed, somewhat embarrassed tones that the painting made them uneasy. They'd say it felt like the figure stared directly at them, and if they walked across the room, that glare followed. I'd laugh it off, offering the same reassuring line that I gave myself. It was just a trick of light. But with every comment, my initial confidence waned. I recall one night, the living room illuminated solely by a single lamp on the side table, casting sharp shadows on the walls. I was reading a magazine, trying to concentrate on mundane articles about home renovation, but my eyes kept drifting to the painting. The lamplight caused subtle reflections in the figure's pupils, as if they were moist, living eyes. A wave of goosebumps traveled down my arms, and I turned away sharply. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as if I were being watched by an actual person. My breathing quickened until I forced myself to exhale slowly, whispering inwardly that I was being irrational. Yet the conviction that someone else shared the room with me grew so intense that my spine stiffened, and a chill crept up from my lower back to the base of my skull. My unease reached new heights a few nights later when I heard a distinct popping sound from the wall. It resembled the sound of wood shifting under pressure, or a nail being pulled slowly from drywall. My heart hammered in my chest. I stood, ignoring the trembling in my legs, and approached the painting. It had tilted slightly to one side, no more than an inch of difference, but enough to draw my attention. It now faced more directly toward my couch, as if adjusting its angle in order to observe me better. A cold bead of sweat ran down my temple, and my tongue felt thick, my mouth dry as I tried to swallow. I reached out, carefully righted the frame, and stepped back. In the hush that followed, the painting remained still. I remember wiping my damp palms on my jeans, hearing the quickened cadence of my own breath. That initial incident was only the start. Over the following week, I discovered the painting had shifted again, this time more noticeably, leaning inward as if craning its neck. I tried every practical explanation I could muster. Maybe the wire at the back was slightly loose, or perhaps vibrations from passing cars in the street caused it to tilt. So I took the painting down, inspected the wire meticulously, and hammered the wall hook more firmly. I placed it back, double-checking that everything was level. My efforts brought me a short-lived relief. Within a day, the painting was crooked again, angled toward my favorite armchair. Standing close, I felt a faint pressure in the air, like a quiet hum near my ears. My heartbeat soared, and a lump formed in my throat. During this period, I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. I told a friend about my suspicious feeling that the painting liked to move on its own, but in a tongue-in-cheek manner, hoping humor might dispel my anxiety. I received an uneasy shrug in response. My friend mentioned that they, too, sensed something off about it, like stepping into a cold spot whenever they stood near the painting. That night I slept fitfully, dreaming of shadowy figures standing at the foot of my bed, wearing a fedora that obscured every facial feature but the eyes. Even upon waking, my heart still drummed painfully against my ribcage. A series of smaller, yet increasingly disturbing incidents piled up day by day. Sometimes, as I sat reading or working on my laptop, the overhead light would flicker. When I looked up, it always seemed that the painting's face bore a subtly different expression. The corners of the mouth appeared either more pinched or more pronounced. My rational mind insisted that I was imagining it. Perhaps I was anxious or exhausted. Still, I couldn't shake the mounting tension that seized my chest whenever I caught that fleeting glimpse. My sense of time also felt distorted. I found myself unsure whether I'd been sitting for minutes or hours, as though something in that room had bent my perception. By the time I realized how long I'd been seated, my muscles felt stiff, my palms clammy. I started avoiding the living room at night. I would finish my dinner in the kitchen and retreat to my bedroom with a book, telling myself I just needed a change of scenery. But my avoidance only fueled my fear. When I finally had to venture into that room, maybe to retrieve an object or straighten a pile of mail, I'd sense my heart rate spike before I even opened the door. The air in there felt heavier, as if the walls pressed inward. My nerves were so on edge that the faint creak of the house settling caused my stomach to clench in panic. One evening, I allowed a little more brightness in by switching on every lamp. I stood in front of the painting, arms folded, determined to confront whatever was happening. I wanted to observe every nuance of its surface. Slowly, I ran my fingertips across the edges of the frame, searching for any mechanical trick. The brushstrokes were thick and somewhat rough, typical of older paintings. The background was intentionally vague, almost fog-like, giving the figure a sense of emerging from or dissolving into shadows. The man's face was expressionless yet oddly intense. He wore a dark overcoat, and the broad rim of his fedora cast half his features in shade. I remember focusing on the eyes for a protracted moment, a dark brown so deep it verged on black. My stomach churned the longer I stared, my breathing shallow. In that interminable silence, I was convinced I felt a faint warmth emanating from the canvas, as if there was a living presence behind the paint. My blood seemed to pound in my ears. When the pressure became unbearable, I drew back, heart racing. Another oddity revealed itself a few nights later. I woke in the small hours of the morning, unable to return to sleep. Feeling restless, I walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed the living room, I became acutely aware of a new noise. It was almost like a low murmur or a distant rumble, and I couldn't identify its source. My chest tightened, and I felt an odd spasm in my legs, as if they threatened to give out. Summoning courage, I flipped on the living room light, expecting to see nothing. To my confusion and dread, the painting seemed even more crooked than usual, this time slanting far enough that one corner had come off the hook. Cold sweat slicked my forehead, and my breath came in quick, shallow bursts. I reached out to fix it, but stopped midway, gripped by the sudden irrational certainty that if I touched it, something terrible would happen. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my pulse throbbing in my temples. Eventually, I forced myself to reposition the frame, wiping my palms on my pajama pants as I did so. Then I hurried back to my bedroom, feeling unsettled by my reaction. Why was I this frightened of a piece of art? Sleep was impossible. I lay staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of every faint squeak in the house, every shift in the wind outside. Several times I half heard faint scraping sounds, or maybe tapping, as though someone was moving around in my living room. My imagination conjured images of the man in the hat stepping out of the canvas, pacing across my floor. A nauseating sense of dread took hold, intensifying with each restless hour. When dawn finally broke, I got out of bed, breathing a trembling sigh of relief at the sunlight filtering through the curtains. The escalation continued. Certain nights, I would wake abruptly with my heart pounding, convinced I heard a soft shuffle near my door. Other times, I caught glimpses of a dark silhouette reflected on the polished wood of the sideboard, only to realize the room was otherwise empty. My reflection in mirrors seemed off-center, as if I wasn't standing where I thought I was. I increasingly questioned my own sanity. I began to wonder if the painting itself had some kind of resonance, an aura that invaded my thoughts. My mind cycled through potential explanations, a leftover energy from its previous owner, or some bizarre psychological effect triggered by the painting's composition. One afternoon, tired of feeling like a captive in my own home, I decided to remove the painting from the living room. I rationalized that if I stored it somewhere else, I could test whether the odd phenomena persisted. With my heart thudding, I carried it down the hallway to a small storage room at the back of the house. My arms felt shaky, as though the painting weighed more than it should. I placed it against the wall inside the storage closet, facing away from the door. After I shut the closet, I took a moment to gather my breath, letting a surge of relief wash over me. The living room felt instantly brighter and lighter without that ever-watchful gaze. For the rest of the day, the house maintained a peaceful hush. No odd creaks, no sense of being watched. I finally relaxed. That night, however, as I prepared for bed, a gnawing unease coiled in my gut, warning me that I shouldn't let my guard down. I recall climbing into bed, feeling the weariness of too many sleepless nights, and drifting into a fitful doze. Then something roused me in the darkness. My throat constricted as I caught the unmistakable feeling of a presence looming just beyond the half-open bedroom door. My pulse roared in my ears. With trembling hands, I flicked on the bedside lamp. The corridor was empty, but I couldn't dispel the tension that clung to my bones. Something felt deeply wrong, as if invisible eyes still tracked me. Sleep abandoned me for the rest of the night. At dawn, I ventured warily into the storage room. My mouth went instantly dry at what I saw. The painting was no longer facing the wall. It had turned as if someone had rotated it to look directly at the door. My scalp prickled, and I felt a wave of cold dread. I might have believed I'd imagined how I placed it the day before, if not for the vivid memory of carefully turning its face away. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached out to move it once more. The surface of the canvas seemed oddly warm to my touch, and a chill of revulsion shuddered through me. I yanked my hand back as though scalded. Although panic clawed at the edges of my mind, I decided I had to confront whatever was happening. I forced myself to sit on the storage room floor, ignoring the cramped feeling in my chest, and stared right into that painted face. I fixated on the minor details, the visible brush lines across the man's brow, the precise way the hat's shadow cut across his features. My legs felt numb, and sweat dotted my forehead. I tried to tell myself there was no way an inanimate object could move on its own. Yet my heart hammered against my ribs with such force that I nearly gasped for air. Eventually, I carried the painting outside, determined to put as much distance between it and myself as possible. I found a spot on my property's covered patio and left it leaning, face in, against the wall out there. I returned to the house, quietly commanding myself not to look back over my shoulder. That night, I felt calmer inside. The sense of oppression lifted ever so slightly, and I even managed a few hours of dreamless sleep. But a dull apprehension lingered at the back of my mind, telling me I hadn't truly resolved anything. In the early hours of morning, I bolted awake to a new, gut-twisting sound, a gentle scraping against an outer wall. My heart pounded so fiercely that my vision momentarily blurred. I reminded myself that it could be a branch or an animal prowling in the yard. With my pulse thudding in my throat, I tiptoed through the dark house to look outside. I nearly stumbled backward as I saw the painting, upright, just outside the living room window, facing in, as though it was gazing through the glass. The shadows cast by the outdoor light stretched its features, making the figure appear monstrous and elongated. My stomach lurched with pure terror. I couldn't breathe properly, each inhalation feeling like shards of ice scraping my lungs. Before my eyes, the wind made the painting sway slightly, producing that soft, scraping noise of the bottom of the frame against the brick wall. In that moment, I felt certain that some force beyond my understanding was operating through the canvas. My fingers were numb, and my scalp tingled as if electricity coursed through it. I realized I had to rid myself of it, no matter the cost. Summoning what remained of my courage, I ran outside and snatched the painting. My hands trembled, and adrenaline spiked my limbs. I didn't allow myself to hesitate. I carried it to my car, tossed it into the trunk, and slammed it shut. Then I drove, ignoring the knot of anxiety twisting in my gut, until I found an out-of-the-way thrift store with a donation drop-off. I remember stepping out of the car, breathing in the damp morning air, and feeling as though I'd run a marathon. My entire body was slick with cold sweat. Heart hammering, I left the painting there, propped up against a gray metal donation box. No second thoughts, no farewell. I simply got back into my car and sped away. My lungs felt ready to burst, but I finally exhaled as I merged into traffic. Relief washed over me like a warm wave, though it was tinged with lingering dread and the absurd fear that the painting might appear in my rearview mirror. That night, I returned home to a house that no longer pressed in on me with invisible weight. I felt as though I could breathe freely again. As I stepped into the living room, I noticed the empty space on the wall where the painting once hung, its absence a reminder of my recent ordeal. A slight tremor went through my limbs as I recalled the final image of that sinister face peering through my window. Yet I also felt gratitude that I had found the resolve to remove it. In the ensuing days, I gradually regained a sense of normalcy. The house returned to being just a house, absent the prickling sensation of unseen eyes. Still, a trace of my paranoia persists. Every so often, if a light flickers unexpectedly or the walls make odd noises, my stomach contracts in reflexive terror. My pulse quickens, and I brace myself for signs of the painting's return, though logically I know it's gone. Sometimes in the stillness of late night, a stray thought creeps into my mind. If I bought it at an auction, I wasn't the first owner, and I might not be the last. Who else might have owned it? And who might end up with it someday? The question leaves me uneasy, my mouth turning dry as I contemplate the possibility that the painting will continue its menacing vigil in some other unsuspecting living room. Even now, as I sit here putting these events into words, I feel a tremor in my hands. My heart rate spikes at every faint sound in the house. There's a strange hollowness in my chest as I recall each eerie moment, each instance of the painting shifting on the wall. each flicker of the man's piercing eyes. I'm grateful that no harm befell me, but the memory alone is enough to keep me on edge. Sometimes it's the intangible things that leave the deepest marks, an impression of being watched when no one is there, a painting that shouldn't be able to move yet does, and the lingering sense that the boundary between the mundane and the inexplicable is thinner than we'd like to believe. I tell myself I did the right thing by distancing myself from that canvas, but a small, persistent doubt plagues me. Did I pass on whatever strange influence it held to someone else? If so, is that malevolent presence already at work in another home? The very thought causes goosebumps to rise on my arms, and my breath grows shallow as if I'm back in the old living room, under that unwavering gaze. So I hold on to the hope that perhaps it will remain tucked away, forgotten among dusty donations, never to be discovered again. Yet I know how it feels to stand before it. The compulsion, that unspoken magnetism. Eventually someone else might not be able to resist. And then, the terror that haunted me could be reborn in another unsuspecting life. In my quieter hours, I try to reassure myself that I'm safe now. The suffocating atmosphere has lifted. My house feels lighter, more alive in a normal way. But occasionally, in the deep hush before dawn, I'll awake with that old dread coursing through me, heart pounding, uncertain what yanked me from slumber. In those moments, I sense a faint echo of eyes upon me, as if somewhere, that man in the hat is still quietly observing from the edges of shadow. And no matter what comforting words I use to calm myself, I cannot entirely banish the primal fear that the painting might find its way back, an uncanny visitor that refuses to remain forgotten. The moment I stepped through the front door, I sensed that this old house resisted my very presence. The air inside felt stale, as if it had never been stirred by a living occupant's breath. Every wooden board under my feet groaned with ancient disapproval. It wasn't simply the gloom of unused rooms or the dust motes drifting in the pale morning light. It was the overwhelming feeling that something watched me from dark corners. The thought pulled at the back of my mind with an unsettling insistence, and no matter how many times I told myself I was being paranoid, I couldn't shake it off. I moved in on a chilly afternoon in late fall. The sky had been overcast, the sun a mere smudge behind dark clouds. The broker had mentioned that the house was decades old, requiring a fair bit of renovation, but I hadn't minded. I was drawn to its character, the ornate wooden banisters, the wide windows, the broad porch. From the outside, the place looked quaint, if slightly neglected. Inside, I discovered creaking floorboards and a faint mustiness that no cleaning product could completely eliminate. Yet something else lurked beneath the physical details, a heaviness in the atmosphere that seemed to intensify once I began unpacking. Several days into my stay, I ventured into the attic to see if there were any leftover items from the previous owners. I found dusty trunks, battered suitcases, and a few half-rotted chairs stacked behind one another. Amid the clutter, shoved against the far wall under a cobweb-laden blanket, was an old radio. It had the kind of design you might see in black and white photos from decades ago. Wooden casing, large dials, and a chipped dial window showing remnants of station numbers. It fascinated me. Although it was filthy and smelled of mildew, I decided to bring it down. I reasoned it could be a unique decorative piece, adding a bit of rustic charm to my new living room. I set it on a small table in the corner of the room, near a window draped with threadbare curtains. That first evening, I tried plugging it in out of curiosity. The radio produced only static and a faint crackle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I fiddled with the dials but couldn't pick up anything intelligible. At last, I unplugged it, figuring it no longer worked. Still, it looked distinctive enough that I left it in place. I recall an odd, almost chemical smell wafting from it, but I dismissed the odor as dust burning off the ancient components. A week slipped by without incident, though the house continued to feel perpetually cold. Even with the furnace on, I woke up shivering in the mornings. At times, I had the distinct impression that I heard footsteps on the second floor, but I told myself it was probably the old beams contracting or the wind rattling the rafters. I tried to block out these small inconveniences and enjoy the sense of having a house all to myself, but the unsettling nature of the space never really left me. Then came that Saturday. I woke in the middle of the night, somewhere around 2 in the morning, with my heart thudding in my chest. My entire bedroom felt like it was pulsating with tension. There was a faint noise coming from downstairs, soft static cutting in and out. The realization that it sounded exactly like the old radio made my scalp prickle with dread. I slipped out of bed, the floor ice cold beneath my bare feet. Each step down the staircase magnified my unease, the static growing louder, more insistent. I kept telling myself I must have forgotten to unplug it before going to bed, yet I was certain I had. When I reached the living room, I saw the radio glowing faintly, its dial flickering with tiny pulses of light. My hands trembled so fiercely that I almost dropped my phone as I tried to illuminate the space better. I saw the power cord trailing across the floor, connected to the wall outlet just as it had been days before. I could have sworn I left it unplugged, but maybe my memory betrayed me. The static hissed and popped, occasionally bursting into quick bursts of distorted speech that I couldn't decipher. The wave of unease grew so strong, I felt sick to my stomach. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my breath came in shallow, trembling rasps. I yanked the plug from the socket. The static died instantly, replaced by the suffocating silence of the house. My hands were slick with sweat, my forehead clammy. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to calm down. Eventually, I told myself that exhaustion must have been playing tricks on my mind. I trudged back to bed, but I slept fitfully, haunted by half-formed dreams of garbled voices calling my name. The next day was gloomy and wet, a constant drizzle tapping on the old windows. The memory of that night lingered in my mind as I went about my routine, but I tried to focus on practical matters, unpacking more boxes, making the house livable. That evening, I double-checked the radio's cord to ensure it was indeed unplugged. I even wrapped the cord around the base, making it impossible for it to slip back into the outlet by accident. Around 2 in the morning, I awoke yet again, heart racing, drenched in sweat. Something was wrong. The air felt thick, as though the oxygen had been drained from it. I heard a faint murmur below. My breathing quickened. My temples pounded. Dread coiled in my gut as I forced myself to go downstairs, step by reluctant step, fighting the urge to run back and barricade myself in my bedroom. I clicked on the living room light, and there it was, the radio, plugged in once more, the dial's faint glow illuminating the corner of the room. Static hissed in waves, interspersed with eerie segments of a voice that sounded both human and not. It was like overhearing a whisper from a nightmare I couldn't fully recall. I remember thinking that maybe I'd done this in my sleep, some bizarre episode of somnambulism or a manifestation of stress. But even as I tried to rationalize, a prickling at the back of my neck told me the explanation was too neat. My mouth felt dry, and my pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. I managed to find the courage to shut the radio off a second time. Afterward, I disconnected the power cord and shoved it into a drawer in the kitchen. I was determined not to let this object torment me. For a few nights, the house stayed quiet. Despite the relative calm, I could not rest easily. My mind refused to let go of the unease. I was hyper-aware of every tiny creak, every brush of branches against the roof. My throat felt tight, my shoulders ached with tension, and I found myself anticipating the sound of static each night. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford. I was so on edge that I started having brief dizzy spells during the day, my vision spotting whenever a sudden noise startled me. Then, near the end of the following week, it happened again. This time, I didn't wake at 2. Instead, I was lying awake, staring at the bedroom ceiling, waiting for something to happen. At around the same time as before, maybe a few minutes past 2, I heard the radio burst into life. It was louder this time, as though the static had purpose and direction. I scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over my own feet. By the time I reached the living room, the static had shifted into a faint, droning voice. The words were unintelligible, stretched and distorted beyond recognition. Yet I felt an undeniable certainty that it was trying to communicate something specifically to me. My pulse pounded so hard I thought I might faint. The radio, still in the same place I had left it, looked otherwise normal. The cord was still missing. I opened the kitchen drawer with shaking hands. The cord was right where I had stashed it, and yet the radio glowed, alive with that faint voice pushing through the interference. I experienced a rush of cold all over my body, as if something invisible had brushed against me. My breath caught in my throat and a wave of nausea rocked me. I wanted to escape, but I felt frozen. Adrenaline surged through me. Yet I stood there, transfixed by the impossible event unfolding in front of my eyes. The voice rose in pitch, dancing on the edge of comprehensibility. It sounded almost like a man's voice, but slowed down or spliced with heavy static. My skin crawled. I told myself in a near-silent internal mantra that this couldn't be real. Slowly, I stepped forward, sweat dripping down the back of my neck, my heart pounding a deafening rhythm. I reached out and tried to turn the knob on the radio. The moment my fingers touched it, a jolt of what felt like static electricity zapped me. I recoiled, stumbling back. My vision swam for a moment, and my breathing became ragged. At that exact instant, the radio sputtered and went dead, leaving me alone in suffocating darkness. My only company was my own trembling breath. I turned on every light in the house and spent the rest of the night in the living room, refusing to let it out of my sight. As days turned into weeks, the phenomenon repeated, always around the same time, always with static crackling through the silence, occasionally accompanied by snatches of warped voices. My nerves were in shreds. I lived in constant fear of nightfall, caught in a vicious cycle of insomnia. My thoughts became more frantic. I stopped inviting visitors because I was too mortified to explain what was going on. I tried telling a friend about the strange occurrences, but when I described it, it sounded unbelievable, even to me. They suggested it was the stress of moving into an old place that might be playing tricks on my mind. I almost believed them, except I felt the physical presence of that disembodied static. I heard it at an hour when everything else was silent, when there was no traffic or bustling street noise. It existed, and it targeted me. I started doubting my own sanity. Perhaps I had carried unresolved issues into this old house. Maybe my mind was conjuring illusions from the musty air in the dark corners. To test my logic, I tried removing the radio from its spot. One afternoon, I wrapped it in a large towel, carried it back to the attic, and stuffed it into a corner. I intended to forget about it altogether. But that night, the noise still came. I stumbled downstairs, flipping on every light switch along the way, only to find the living room empty. No radio in sight. Yet the static grew louder, emanating from nowhere and everywhere at once. My skin tingled, my vision narrowed, and I sank to my knees, feeling an overwhelming wave of vertigo. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound vanished. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, lights blazing around me. Each minute lasted a small eternity. My entire body was rigid, drenched in sweat, and every muscle ached with tension. By the time the sun finally rose, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. The radio wasn't just an artifact. It was a magnet for something I couldn't rationally explain, and my mind was unraveling under its influence. I decided I had to get rid of it. Not just stash it away, but truly remove it from my life. The next day, in a fit of desperation, I took the radio and drove to a salvage yard outside of town. My hands shook the entire drive, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it switch on by itself. When I handed it over, the staff told me they'd see if it was salvageable or just scrap. I didn't even wait for them to finish talking. I left it there without looking back. After that, the house felt lighter, if still haunted by memory. The nights grew quieter. The suffocating dread I had lived with for nearly a month receded. Yet each time I passed that corner of the living room, I felt a flutter of anxiety. The mental scars persisted. My sleep improved little by little, but on certain nights, I startled awake. convinced I heard the faint hiss of static in the distance. My heart would drum a frantic beat, and I'd taste fear like bitter metal on my tongue. Then I'd realize it was only the wind or the settling of the house. Even so, the memory never completely left me. A few weeks went by. Gradually, I began to trust my surroundings again. The hallway no longer filled me with an inexplicable dread. The attic became just another storage area. The floorboards' groans were merely the natural sounds of old wood. Life began to feel almost normal, but I couldn't shake the notion that something had been woken or coaxed into awareness by that old radio. Occasionally, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half imagining a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. My rational mind told me it was only the leftover anxiety from those nights of terror, but the deeper part of my psyche remained skeptical. Even now, as I sit in this living room and recall the events, a clammy wave of apprehension crawls along my skin. I can still feel the pounding of my heart from those nights, still hear the distorted rasp of a voice that felt too real to be a mere malfunction. And though I like to believe I escaped whatever force lurked behind that endless static, a part of me suspects it clings to me, just out of sight, waiting for another opening. Sometimes, in the stillness before dawn, I have the sense that something stands behind me, just beyond my peripheral vision, observing in silence. No one was harmed, no blood was spilled. But in many ways, the ordeal changed me. My nights are no longer filled with the naive comfort of peaceful dreams. I carry an undercurrent of vigilance, an unwillingness to accept absolute safety within these walls, or anywhere else. The radio is gone, but the memories remain, reverberating like an echo that never fully fades. And whenever I feel the air turn still, or the shadows around me deepen, I remember the hiss of static that once disturbed my nights, reminding me that sometimes what we dismiss as old junk may hold onto fragments of a past we can never truly understand. Darkness settles in my apartment like a living presence, clinging to every corner and muffling the faint hum of the city outside. Even with lamps scattered across each cramped room, shadows seem to pool at the edges of the worn carpet and seep into the cracks of the peeling wallpaper. I can't say I ever felt entirely comfortable here, but for the most part, I've been able to live with the creaking pipes and persistent drafts. That changed on a particular night when the air turned unnervingly cold, and a whisper, barely audible, drifted out of the kitchen as though it had been spoken directly into my ear. That night, I learned that isolation can be terrifying when it feels like you're not really alone. I'm a grown man who has never believed in the supernatural. My nights used to consist of scrolling through social media on my laptop, occasionally watching low-budget horror movies that I'd laugh off without a second thought. Now, I question every noise in the dark. It started around 3 a.m. I'd been squinting at the computer screen, my eyes heavy with fatigue, yet my mind too restless to sleep. The building was deathly quiet. No neighbors arguing, no distant city sirens, not even the soft buzz of fluorescent lighting in the hallway. Then, cutting through that silence, I heard it. A murmur, almost like someone breathing against the phone and trying to speak at the same time. My heart thudded in my chest as I paused the video on my screen and listened, but the sound vanished. I tried to rationalize. It could have been the pipes shuddering, or my ears playing tricks after hours of wearing headphones. Still, I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that something else was going on. My gut twisted, and the hair on my arms stood on end. With a growing sense of dread, I rose from my chair, each step making the floor protest under my weight. Every board seemed to creak louder than usual, as though betraying my position to whatever might be lurking just beyond the light's reach. When I reached the kitchen, I was met with darkness, thick and absolute. The small overhead bulb in there had flickered out the week before, and I hadn't bothered to replace it yet. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the street lamp that bled through the window. I stood in the doorway, letting my eyes adjust. That was when I noticed a slight shape near the counter, outlined by the dim light. Some kind of figure, but definitely human-sized. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse hammered against my ribs, and my entire body tensed, ready to flee or fight. In a single frantic motion, I flipped the switch on the wall, flooding the kitchen with the stark glow of the overhead light I'd forgotten actually still worked. The shape disappeared instantly, leaving behind only the silent counters and the sink full of dishes I'd been avoiding. My mouth went dry, and beads of sweat trickled along my temple. I scanned every inch of that small, cluttered space, under the table, behind the fridge, inside the cabinets. Not one thing was out of place. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I drifted off, the memory of that silhouette, so still, yet unmistakable, invaded my thoughts. My mattress felt like it was suffocating me. I was hot, but also cold, heart racing as I imagined footsteps in the hallway or a faint scraping against the walls. By morning, I had barely rested. Under the bright light of day, I almost convinced myself I had hallucinated the entire thing. For the next few nights, I stationed myself on the living room couch. Part of me wanted to be closer to the kitchen. If there was an intruder or some unknown presence, I wanted to catch it in the act. At first, nothing happened. I'd sit in the flickering glow of the television, the volume muted so I could listen for any irregular sound. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd grow uneasy, feel my skin prickle, but then the night would pass without incident. I caught myself nearly dozing off on the third night when I heard it again. That faint whisper, a hushed voice, as though someone were confiding secrets they didn't want overheard. It was so low that I couldn't distinguish words, but I sensed fear in its tone. Maybe desperation. My palms were damp with sweat, and I rubbed them against my jeans as I forced myself to stand. Something about hearing a voice you can't decipher is more disturbing than a shout or a scream. It's that secrecy, that unknown. My heart pounded as I crept toward the kitchen, each step made deliberately to avoid the squeaky floorboards. The TV's glow lit my path just enough to see the outline of the kitchen doorway. When I leaned my head around the corner, I froze. The silhouette was there again, faint and motionless. The shape looked almost blurred, like it was flickering in and out of reality. The hush of breath reached my ears once more, so close it made the hairs at the back of my neck stand on end. My instinct screamed to run, but my curiosity pinned me in place. I stared at the figure, trying to force my eyes to focus, to see if it was a trick of the light or an actual entity. The shadow seemed to ripple, and a strange pressure built in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't pull away, couldn't summon the will to flick the switch this time. I just stood there shivering, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Then, as quickly as it had formed, the silhouette dissolved into the surrounding darkness. My legs almost gave out beneath me. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, breath caught in my throat. My hands trembled and I had to lean against the counter to steady myself. By the time I gathered the courage to flip the light, the kitchen was just as empty as before. Not a single cupboard door was open. No drawers had been disturbed. I kept telling myself that if there were a real intruder, I'd see signs, footprints, a broken lock, something. But every inch of the apartment was untouched. The next day I confided in a friend over the phone, describing what I'd seen, my voice shaking as I detailed the silhouette that appeared near the kitchen. The response was mild sympathy and a suggestion that I might be overstressed, overworked, or suffering from insomnia. I wanted to believe that explanation. Yet as darkness fell again, a thick knot formed in my stomach. My mind flickered with images of that shape, that whisper, and the mounting sense that something within these walls defied all logic. The atmosphere in my apartment grew oppressive. Even walking into the kitchen to fix a quick dinner felt like wading through an unseen barrier. The air was heavier, saturated with an uncomfortable stillness. I began noticing small details that unsettled me. The sink faucet occasionally dripping in slow, rhythmic drops that echoed in the night. The faint scritch noises behind the walls, like nails tapping against drywall, and the overhead light in the hallway flickering at random intervals, as though it had a life of its own. On particularly tense nights, I'd wake up gasping, convinced I heard scraping at my bedroom door. Then, I'd spring out of bed, throw the door open, and find only the dark hallway and the faint hum of the fridge. My body would be drenched in cold sweat, my pajamas sticking uncomfortably to my skin as I tried to calm my labored breathing. It felt like the apartment was testing me, prodding my vulnerabilities, feeding on my fear. My reflection in the bathroom mirror began to look gaunt, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and paranoia. I tried every rational avenue to break this cycle. I left the living room light on through the night, assuming that more illumination would chase away the nightmares. The murmuring persisted, drifting to me even when my television was on. Sometimes, it was so faint I thought it might be my own thoughts echoing inside my skull. Other times, it was clear enough to make my pulse pound as I searched the apartment, flipping switches, opening drawers, checking that the windows were securely locked. Nothing ever explained the noise. That creeping chill in the air seemed to deepen with every subsequent night. At one point, I considered that maybe I was losing my mind. Sleep deprivation can distort reality. But an encounter a few days later stripped away any comforting illusions. I returned home from a late shift, my shoulders stiff and my posture tense, anticipating another long night of intangible dread. The second I stepped through the door, I sensed a shift, like the temperature dropping 10 degrees in a heartbeat. My teeth started to chatter. The living room lamp flickered, and in that staccato glow, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the hallway, near the entrance to my bedroom. A tremor ran down my spine, and my knees nearly buckled. My breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. The silhouette was darker than any normal shadow should be, as if it absorbed the dim light around it. In those few seconds, my mouth went dry, and I felt the thunder of my own pulse. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't reach for the switch on the wall. I took a slow step forward, and the figure moved too, just a shift, but enough to remind me it was not a static illusion. In a desperate attempt to dispel the terror, I forced myself to rush toward it, flicking the hallway light as I approached. The bulb popped and went out instantly, plunging me into deeper darkness. Panic surged in my chest, so intense that I thought my heart would tear through my ribcage. In the suffocating blackness, I felt a presence near me, an icy breath on my cheek that made me jerk away and press against the wall. My lungs burned as I struggled to breathe. Then the living room lamp regained its steady glow, and I found myself alone. The silhouette had vanished, as though it had been swallowed by the darkness itself. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright, my back against the wall, eyes darting from doorway to doorway, half expecting a face to emerge from the shadowy corners. Every tiny noise, the refrigerator clicking, the old pipes groaning, felt like an attack on my already frayed nerves. My mind raced with possibilities. A restless spirit? A figment of my anxiety? Was I hallucinating, or was something truly haunting these cramped rooms? By the time dawn arrived, I felt delirious, uncertain if I was teetering on the edge of madness. Unable to bear another encounter, I decided to take drastic measures. I brought in items meant to ward off evil, although I never believed in that sort of thing. I rearranged the furniture, pushing my couch to face the kitchen directly. It felt like I was building a fortress in my living room, determined to keep any presence at bay. I even shoved a heavy chair under the doorknob of my bedroom at night, as if it would help. Deep down, I knew such efforts were futile against whatever intangible force had settled here. In the subsequent nights, the whispers grew bolder, breaking through even the white noise of the television. They sometimes seemed to call my name, though I could never be sure if that was just my mind filling in the gaps. The shape appeared more frequently, drifting across my vision, always just out of reach. The apartment felt claustrophobic, its walls closing in, the air thick with the scent of old plaster and stale fear. Occasionally, I'd sense a subtle pressure behind me, as if someone loomed close enough to brush against my shoulder, but every time I turned around, I was alone. A profound paranoia took hold. My instincts told me I was never entirely by myself. Even stepping into the bathroom to wash my face, I'd keep the door open, eyes flicking back to the hallway. My reflection in the mirror looked haunted, eyes bloodshot, skin clammy from sleepless nights. I started double-checking every lock and bolt in my home, but no matter how meticulously I secured the place, the feeling of an intruder remained. It was worse than any normal invasion because I had no idea how to fight back against a presence that left no physical trace. The final tipping point came after a restless evening when I thought I heard the murmur directly behind the kitchen door. Summoning a surge of courage, I yanked it open, my heart pounding in anticipation of seeing that dreadful silhouette. Instead, I saw my own trembling reflection in the window above the sink, sweat dripping down my temples. For a split second, though, it looked as if there was another face behind mine, pale and contorted in anguish. My stomach turned, and a wave of nausea washed over me. My hands shook so violently I could barely keep the phone steady when I considered calling someone, anyone, to tell them what was happening. But I knew their disbelief would only deepen my isolation. Something snapped within me in that moment. The terror was like a spider's web, and I was trapped. I could feel it clinging to my thoughts, tangling my logic, suffocating my sense of safety. I wanted to scream at whatever lurked there, demand it show itself and explain why it had chosen me. Instead, I stood in stunned silence, the echo of my ragged breathing filling the apartment. The shape, the whispers, the flickering lights, they all felt personal now, as though this presence had singled me out, feeding on my fear. I made my decision that very night. I gathered a handful of essentials, phone charger, a change of clothes, my laptop, and left the apartment without allowing myself a moment of doubt. The instant I crossed the threshold into the hallway, a wave of relief and dread washed over me simultaneously. Relief, because I was no longer caged by those four walls. Dread, because something told me this wasn't over. Whatever had taken root in that apartment, it felt intimately tied to me. Still, I trudged forward, ignoring the goosebumps that sprouted on my arms as I pressed the elevator button. The mechanical whir of the elevator's descent was almost soothing compared to the oppressive silence I was leaving behind. I didn't return for several days, crashing on a friend's couch instead. During that time, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Exhaustion, loneliness, the power of suggestion. But every night, my chest still tightened, anticipating a whisper that never came, or a silhouette at the corner of my vision that wasn't there. The absence of the apartment's ominous atmosphere should have been comforting, yet I couldn't sleep any better. I was haunted by the possibility that I had abandoned my home to something I couldn't even define. In the end, I went back. I told myself it was just to gather more belongings, maybe to see if the phenomenon persisted in my absence. The moment I stepped inside, the air seemed thick again, pressing against my skin. Yet the apartment was silent. I walked through each room with cautious steps, scanning every corner, every dark recess. No murmur greeted me, no silhouette drifted near the kitchen. I felt an almost crushing sense of anticipation, waiting for the hush of breath or the flicker of a shape by the sink. But nothing happened. I don't know if that made it better or worse. Part of me wanted confirmation that I wasn't insane, that something truly haunted this space. Another part prayed for peace. Days have passed, and though I've continued to sleep in my bedroom, the memory of that voice lingers. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faintest echo of a murmur, like a conversation in the next room that dissolves the instant I step forward. My heart races at every shadow that moves, every flicker of the lights, and there are moments when I catch a glimpse of a shape in my peripheral vision, so quickly gone that I can't be certain it was ever there. I wish I had a neat conclusion, an exorcism, a rational explanation, or even a chance to confront whatever stalks these rooms. The truth is, I remain in this apartment, unsure if I'm imagining these things, or if some entity clings to my life with quiet insistence. At times, the fear recedes, and I believe the worst is behind me, until a whisper in the night jolts me upright, my heart pounding, my breath quickening, cold sweat coating my skin. Each time, I wonder if it's just my mind unraveling, or if something still stands unseen in the dark, biding its time. Either way, I may never truly be alone here, and that realization is more chilling than anything I could have ever conjured in my nightmares. I heard the wind howling against the windows as soon as I walked into the clinic that night, a low, keening sound that set my nerves on edge from the start. There was a weight in the air, a heaviness I couldn't quite identify, as though the building itself were exhaling in ragged, uneasy gasps. My first thought was that maybe the old heater was acting up again. But there was something else, a subtle sensation, like a presence lurking just beyond the threshold of understanding. I tried to shrug it off, forced myself to focus on my volunteer duties, but I could feel a sort of static charge prickling along my arms the moment I took my place at the front desk. I had been working there for a few months, trying to gain experience while finishing an animal care course. The clinic stayed open all night for emergencies, and I had volunteered for the late shift to prove my dedication. The veterinarian on duty, Dr. Caldwell, was busy in the back rooms attending to a stray cat that had been brought in earlier. The reception area was washed in fluorescent light that seemed too bright one moment, then too dim the next, casting odd shadows on the beige walls. I remember every tiny detail from that night, because something about the silence felt alive, like the hush in a forest just before something leaps out from the darkness. The waiting room chairs, empty and lined up in neat rows, looked almost like silent witnesses to something I couldn't see. The smell of antiseptic was thick, and the heater's fan emitted a monotonous drone. It should have been comforting, that hum, but instead, it felt like an out-of-tune orchestra, constantly reminding me of how alone I was. From the hallway leading deeper into the clinic, a flickering light caught my eye. It was subtle, just a gentle stutter in the fluorescent tube overhead. But at night, in a place designed to be sterile and controlled, any unpredictable flicker felt like a sign that things were off balance. I got up from my seat and took a few steps toward the corridor. My chest felt tight, as though an invisible band pressed around my ribs. Every breath was slightly labored, and my heartbeat thudded in my ears. I could see the corridor stretched far to the back, where it branched off into the emergency section and the surgery rooms. The overhead lights cast the floor in a harsh glow, but at the edges of my vision, everything seemed to waver in and out of focus, like peering through heat waves on scorching pavement. Something about that corridor always made me uneasy. Too many closed doors, too many corners where a person could vanish from view. Usually, it was bustling with staff and patients, but tonight it was as still as a crypt. I pulled my gaze away and returned to the reception desk, determined not to let my imagination run wild. Time dragged. I shuffled paperwork, tried to stay busy, but every so often, I thought I saw a shadow move along the edge of the hallway, darting out of sight the moment I looked up. My heart would skip a beat, leaving me with that sinking, hollow feeling in my stomach. I reasoned it away. Maybe it was just the fluorescent tubes buzzing or a reflection from my own movements. Yet the subtle waves of anxiety kept building, and I found myself swallowing hard to keep my throat from drying out. Then, without warning, a loud crash echoed from the emergency corridor. It sounded like a door being slammed with incredible force, and it was followed by another slam and another, each blow reverberating through the walls. My breath caught, my pulse hammered, and for a moment, my mind went blank. I strained to listen, convinced it must be the wind, or maybe another staff member moving things around. But the noise was too rhythmic, too deliberate, door after door, slamming in an eerie sequence. I sprang up from my chair, adrenaline tearing through my veins. The corridor lights flickered more intensely now, the droning overhead lamp back in reception sputtering like it might die at any second. I rushed to the hallway, half expecting to see someone banging doors in a fit of anger. But the moment I stepped around the corner, the corridor fell silent. Not a single door was out of place. The hallway was empty, and all the doors were shut. My neck tingled, and a cold bead of sweat slid down my spine. I tried to steady my breathing as I moved forward, checking each door. They were locked or at least firmly closed, and none showed signs of having been forcibly slammed. My own footsteps echoed on the linoleum, the sound magnified by the tension thrumming through my body. I thought about calling Dr. Caldwell, but something in the back of my mind held me back. Maybe I didn't want to appear jumpy or incompetent. Still, I couldn't ignore the pounding of my own heart. The corridor led to the exam rooms, and I made myself open each door to check. The flickering fluorescent lights painted everything in a harsh, strobing glare, making the shadows lurch and dance. Each room was deserted, and all the windows were locked tight. The air had grown thick, as though every breath needed an extra effort. My stomach twisted at the notion that I might be alone in hearing these noises. Could my mind have been playing tricks on me? My grip on the doorknobs felt slick with perspiration, and my hands trembled so badly I had to clench them to keep steady. After what felt like an eternity, I returned to the reception area, the tension in my chest still coiled like a spring. Just as I was about to sit down, the slamming started again. It was so loud it rattled the pictures on the walls, and I felt the reception desk vibrate against my hip. My nerves were already frayed, and I nearly jumped out of my skin at that repetitive tum-tum-tum. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would tear through my rib cage. This time I ran back down the hall more quickly, calling out to see if anybody was there. No response, but the moment I reached the corridor, the noise stopped dead. Nothing looked out of place. A chill settled at the base of my skull, and a wave of goosebumps spread across my arms. My breath was ragged, and my throat was so dry it hurt to swallow. I tried to steady myself, telling my brain to calm down, but the dread only grew stronger. I remembered Dr. Caldwell was still in the back, so I hurried toward the surgical suite. I found him meticulously cleaning instruments. He looked up, surprised to see me so agitated, and he asked, in an even tone, what was wrong. I explained I heard repeated door slams. He shook his head. He'd heard nothing. According to him, it was perfectly calm in the back, just the normal hum of the machines. That didn't soothe my racing pulse at all. I could barely speak in coherent sentences, but he seemed to notice my pallor and suggested I take a moment to breathe. He patted me on the shoulder, then continued his work, apparently unruffled. When I returned to the front, the sense of isolation felt even more potent. The lights flickered again, that stuttering gloom creeping across the walls. I tried to bury my anxiety in basic tasks, filing paperwork, rearranging brochures about pet care, but my mind refused to focus. Each rustle of paper felt magnified. Each scrape of my shoe on the floor shot like an electric jolt through my body. Every nerve in my system was on high alert, as though expecting another violent crash at any second. I decided to check the outside. Maybe, I thought, there was a draft or a loose gutter banging around. Stepping beyond the double glass doors, I found the parking lot empty except for my car and Dr. Caldwell's. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting cones of sickly yellow light across the asphalt. A cold breeze brushed past me, but it was gentle, certainly not strong enough to slam heavy doors. I stood there for a moment, scanning the perimeter. The clinic was perched on a quiet block, and at that hour no one else was around. Yet I couldn't shake the uncanny sensation of being watched. My eyes darted to the shadows lurking near the dumpster at the corner of the lot. The wind blew a plastic bag across the ground, making a faint crinkling noise that made me clench my teeth. Everything looked normal enough, but it felt like I was walking through a dream where the environment was only pretending to be ordinary. An oppressive weight pressed down on my shoulders, as though the atmosphere itself wanted me to feel vulnerable. I forced myself back inside, shutting the door behind me and double-checking that the lock was secure. The reception area seemed different now, dimmer somehow. The overhead lights still glowed, but they felt muted, like the color had been drained from the world. My hands shook slightly, so I rubbed them together to generate warmth, but my palms remained clammy. It didn't help that the animals in the kennels behind the surgery room were eerily silent. Not a single bark, not a single meow. I found that unnatural. Usually, at night, even the best-behaved pets let out a whimper or a shuffle. Their silence felt like an omen, as though they sensed something I couldn't fully understand. My pulse pounded harder, just thinking about how all those creatures remained perfectly still and quiet. Another sudden noise broke my chain of thought. This time, it wasn't exactly a slam, but more like a series of thuds traveling along the wall. Each thud felt closer, as if something was moving down the corridor, pounding on the walls as it passed. Cold sweat dripped down the back of my neck. I could almost picture the shape of a figure stalking through the hall, unseen. My throat constricted, and I found myself whispering under my breath, some nonsensical reassurance that everything was okay, when I knew it wasn't. With my heart threatening to burst, I forced myself to approach the corridor once more. The lights flickered in a maddening pattern, bathing the walls in a pulse of alternating brightness and shadow. My body trembled from head to toe, and I could feel my lips turning dry and cracked. There was a dull ache in my temples as the tension seized my entire body. I paused at the threshold, bracing myself for the improbable sight of those doors slamming again, or the walls reverberating. I stood there, breathing hard, straining to hear anything over the roar of my own pulse. But the hallway was silent once more, like a trap laying in wait. I hesitated, feeling almost dizzy, and reached for the wall to steady myself. The corridor seemed to stretch farther than usual, as though the geometry had shifted to become an endless path. A wave of nausea crept up, my stomach twisting with primal dread. Suddenly, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A door, one I was sure had been closed, was now ajar. It was a small supply room. My scalp tingled, and I had the unsettling sensation that if I looked too directly at that door, something would be looking back at me. My skin prickled, and I forced myself to take a step forward. My legs felt stiff, like I was moving through thick mud. Each step brought a jolt of adrenaline that made my hands shake uncontrollably. Reaching the supply room, I placed my hand on the door. The surface was cold, almost clammy. My breath came in ragged gasps. I nudged the door open, finding nothing but shelves of bandages, disinfectant, and spare blankets. Yet the air inside that tiny space felt suffocating, thick with tension. My eyes scanned the shelves for any sign of disturbance. Everything looked in order. Still, that sense of being watched persisted, as though a phantom presence hovered just behind me. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding so violently it nearly deafened me. I closed the door gently, but the echo of the latch reverberated in my ears like a thunderclap. That's when I felt I had to find Dr. Caldwell and get him to verify I wasn't losing my mind. I practically raced down the corridor to the surgical suite. I found him finishing the procedure he'd been working on, calm as ever. He looked at me, concern etched on his face, and asked if I was okay. I tried to explain the noises again, how they'd been happening repeatedly, how I felt something was roaming the corridors. He seemed puzzled that he hadn't heard a thing. He offered to walk with me to the reception area. We made our way through the corridor together, him scanning each room for any sign of intrusion. Nothing. No slamming, no flickering, not even a squeak. The hallway was as innocuous as a school corridor under fluorescent glare, the only sound being our footsteps. We reached the front, and he left me at the desk, telling me to call him if it happened again. His reassurance felt hollow, and I could see my own fear reflected in his widened eyes. He tried to maintain composure, but I sensed my pale face and trembling hands had unsettled him. Left alone once more, I paced behind the desk, my muscles drawn tight. The entire clinic felt oppressive, as though the walls might close in at any moment. The flickering lights returned, but they were subtler now, as if dancing just at the edge of my peripheral vision. My eyelids felt gritty, and my heartbeat never fully returned to a normal rhythm. The hush in the waiting room pressed against my ears, turning each tiny noise into an ominous event. Then, the final crescendo, a sudden violent series of door slams that erupted one after another, traveling all the way from the back of the clinic toward the reception area. It was like a rolling thunder, each crash building on the last. The floors vibrated beneath my feet. My breath caught, and a wave of terror swept over me so fierce it nearly buckled my knees. Yet, as soon as I gathered the courage to dash toward the corridor, the slamming ceased. Complete and utter silence followed, broken only by the frantic pounding in my chest. I stood there, half expecting something to burst from the hallway. I could feel pinpricks of sweat along my forehead, and my vision blurred at the edges. Nothing emerged. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Caldwell came back up front, finishing his shift. He found me pale and drenched in sweat, my pulse still hammering. He asked what was going on, but I couldn't find the words. My mouth felt like sandpaper, and I could barely force out an explanation. By then, the silence reigned again. No howling wind, no creaking doors, no flickering lights. Even the oppressive feeling seemed to withdraw, like something had decided to leave just as quickly as it had arrived. Dr. Caldwell looked around, perplexed. He stated he hadn't heard anything at all, insisting it must have been quiet in the operating room. The absence of any reaction from the animals only deepened my dread. If something truly menacing had passed through, why hadn't they reacted? I'll never forget the final moments of my shift, sitting there in the reception area, every muscle wound tight, waiting for another burst of terror that never came. My eyes darted to every shadow and corner, anticipating movement that didn't materialize. Eventually, my breathing slowed, and I realized my entire body felt drained, like I had run a marathon. I kept expecting some final sign or manifestation, some clue that would confirm I wasn't hallucinating. When my shift ended, I practically flew out the door, relief mingling with the persistent dread that something might still follow me. I could feel an invisible weight at my back until I stepped into my car and locked it. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that the clinic, in its fluorescent emptiness, was staring after me. I still can't explain what caused those slamming doors. No gust of wind was strong enough. Dr. Caldwell didn't witness or hear a single thing. The animals remained utterly silent. I've run every possible scenario through my head. Faulty hinges, my own stress levels peaking, or something else that defies ordinary explanation. I sometimes dream about that corridor, the lights flickering, doors slamming in a relentless chain, and the sense that a dark presence is trailing me. When I wake up, my heart feels like it's going to explode and my sheets are soaked in sweat. Even now, I'm left to wonder if what I experienced was a fleeting episode of paranoia or something beyond the rationale. There's a nagging suspicion that the clinic harbors an energy unseen, that maybe certain places soak up the fear and pain that pass through them and reflect it back at unsuspecting souls like me. I return to volunteer again, but I've never experienced anything so dramatic since. Sometimes, though, late at night, I'll hear a distant thump or a door creak, and that icy terror ignites in my veins all over again. I try to reassure myself it was all in my head, yet I remain haunted by those hours. Part of me craves a definitive answer, and part of me prefers not to know. I still wake in the middle of the night with the phantom echo of slamming doors reverberating in my mind. That moment when I stood alone in the flickering corridor, with the overwhelming sensation of being stalked by something invisible, remains etched in my psyche. Perhaps it's best left unexplained, because whatever lurks in those corridors, whether a trick of my imagination or something that defies logic, it felt real enough to sink its claws into my fear and never entirely let go. I remember the exact moment when everything changed. The unrelenting night pressed against my window, and a slow, agonizing creak rose from somewhere beneath my feet. The sound was neither loud nor obvious, yet it carried an unsettling weight, like a whisper that somehow felt far too close to my ear. That was the first time I realized there are things that prowl in the darkness, things that do not respect locked doors or tall walls. Back then, I lived in a cramped studio apartment, just a few scuffed floor tiles wide, a bed jammed into a corner, and a tiny sink near the door. The place was situated above a bar, and even on quiet nights, I could still sense the stale odor of spilled beer and hear the muffled rhythm of jukebox tunes drifting up through the floorboards. But none of that prepared me for the deeper, stranger noises that would define my nights. The drawn-out groan of wood under a hidden weight, and the shiver of realization that someone, or something, was out there. I first noticed it on a Tuesday night, around midnight. The bar downstairs was already shuttered, its lights off, the front door locked. The usual chatter had faded by then, leaving only the faint hum of a distant street lamp outside. My building had a small, walled-in yard behind it, an unkempt place where the bar's owner kept old tables and broken chairs, all piled against the back fence. It was rarely used, and I hardly ever went down there unless I needed some fresh air. That night, as I stood by my single window, I heard a noise that seemed both mundane and terrifyingly out of place, a creaking, like the slow bending of wood under a heavy footstep. It was the kind of noise you'd expect from a decaying door hinge or a warped plank in a deserted house. But I had never heard it in that yard before. Something about it set my pulse racing. The moment it registered in my mind, I felt an electric jolt of fear and curiosity. After a few seconds of hesitation, I told myself I had to check. My heart pounded violently in my chest as I descended the stairs and slipped out the back door, each step echoing with an uneasy dread. The yard was a patch of dirt and cracked pavement enclosed by high concrete walls. Under the faint moonlight, I could make out the silhouettes of stacked wooden tables, their surfaces warped from years of neglect. At first, everything looked perfectly still, but then my eyes fell on the ground near the biggest pile of disused furniture. There, in the moist dirt, I saw footprints, massive ones, far larger than my own, and they were definitely human-shaped, yet noticeably broader and longer, without the slightest sign of a shoe. I felt my scalp prickle as I knelt down for a closer look. My own foot, roughly a size 10, was dwarfed in comparison. A wave of cold sweat trickled down my temples. It wasn't just the size that unnerved me. It was the detail. I could see the lines of the sole, the curvature of the toes. The tracks continued for a short stretch, circling near a battered wooden table, and then vanished entirely without leading toward any exit. No scuff marks on the wall, no muddy smears on the fence. It was like whoever, or whatever, had made them, had simply stopped existing. My breathing became shallow, and my limbs felt tense, as though preparing for some unseen threat. The wind rustled a stray plastic bag that was caught against the fence, making me jerk around. I saw nothing else moving, no sign of forced entry, no break in the wall. I went back upstairs, locking the door behind me more carefully than usual. My hands were shaking so much it took 3 tries to secure the latch. I wondered if I had heard wrong, or if I had been mistaken about the footprints. My mind spun with possibilities. Maybe someone had hopped the fence but then leapt out again, or maybe they had a key to a hidden gate. Yet none of those ideas explained the size of those footprints, or how they abruptly ended. That night, I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt a rush of adrenaline, as if my body braced itself for another noise, another sign that something was outside. Over the next few days, I questioned the bar's owner indirectly. I mentioned hearing strange noises at night, and he replied that he never bothered installing cameras in those blind spots around the yard. His attitude was casual, but I detected a slight furrow in his brow, as though the notion of intruders disturbed him more than he let on. He asked if I was sure it wasn't an animal rummaging around, but I avoided telling him the full story. I felt a surge of apprehension that if I brought up the footprints, he'd accuse me of paranoia, or worse, he'd start asking questions about how big they were, and I'd have no reasonable explanation. Still, I felt his concern. He said he'd keep an eye out for anything suspicious, though he never mentioned actually checking the yard himself after hours. Night after night, I stayed vigilant, waiting for the slightest hint of that creaking sound. Sometimes the hours after midnight would pass uneventfully, and I almost convinced myself it was a one-time occurrence. But then, on a Saturday, while I was lying in bed reading, I heard it again, softer than before, but definitely the same wooden groan. My body tensed, my heart hammering against my ribcage. I got up, flicked off my lamp so I wouldn't be visible through the window, and peered out into the darkness. The yard was only partially lit by a slender slice of moonlight, and I struggled to see past the twisted shapes of the stacked tables. Then the sound came once more, this time a slow, deliberate creak, as though something with considerable weight was shifting its balance on a fragile plank. Goosebumps covered my arms, and my breathing turned shallow. Against my better judgment, I slipped on my shoes and made my way downstairs, ignoring the pounding in my ears. I inched open the back door, letting in the cool night air that was thick with tension. I stepped onto the dirt, scanning for anything out of place. Once again, I found footprints. They were nearly identical to the first ones I had discovered, just as large, just as human-like, and just as abruptly cut off. They started by the door and circled near the table pile, then vanished again as if the creature had dematerialized. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I wanted to shout, to call out for someone or something to answer, but my throat seized. The sensation of being watched grew almost unbearable. A heavy sensation settled in my chest, as though the very air had thickened. I stood there for a few minutes, struggling with the thought that if I turned the wrong corner, I'd come face to face with something I couldn't explain. My hands trembled at my sides, and I noticed a faint trembling in my legs as well. The bar was locked up tight behind me, and the old wooden fence loomed to my left, no signs of tampering. I muttered under my breath that it had to be a trick of the light, or an animal leaving misleading tracks. Yet I couldn't dismiss the outline of toes clearly imprinted in the soil, nor the sense that an invisible presence lingered within those shadows. Over the following weeks, it became a torturous ritual. Every so often after midnight, I'd hear the floorboards creak from below or from somewhere just outside the building. If I mustered the courage to go downstairs, I'd find those same footprints. I mentioned the issue to a friend who asked about my building, and I described the yard and the old furniture. He suggested I might be half asleep and hallucinating, or that my stress from work was manifesting in bizarre ways. Another time, I overheard a couple of regular patrons talking about hearing weird noises at night, but they shrugged it off as cats. I said nothing, but my insides felt knotted. I knew I wasn't the only one catching these unsettling cues. Each night I lost more sleep, lying in bed, staring at the dim ceiling, the only light coming from the flicker of a neon sign across the street. My mind conjured images of what could have made those footprints. A giant drifter who managed to slip in and out with impossible stealth, or something less tangible, a phantom anchored to that yard, attracted by the rotting wood or the echo of voices in the bar. My logic warred with my growing paranoia. No matter how often I reminded myself that real people made real footprints, a creeping dread told me that something else was at play. By the time the next month rolled around, I found myself jumping at every sound. My body reacted instantly whenever a floorboard squeaked, or when a passing car's headlights threw shifting shadows through my window. Even in broad daylight, I felt uneasy, as if the yard behind the building was somehow waiting. My appetite waned and my mouth was perpetually dry. My palms sweat whenever I had to pass through the yard to toss out my garbage. During the day, nothing looked particularly ominous, just broken chairs and dusty tables, the ground scattered with cigarette butts and plastic cups. But even under the sun, I felt as though the place was quietly mocking me, reminding me that at night, it transformed into a stage for something unknown. One early morning, I forced myself to investigate the yard in daylight, determined to see if there were any hidden trapdoors or holes in the fence. I clutched a crowbar in one hand, my grip so tight my knuckles turned white. I combed through the clutter, overturning old tables and chairs, expecting to find some secret passage. The only discoveries were spiders, rusted nails, and damp wood that fell apart under a slight pull. There was no sign that anyone had carved a path out. The fence was sturdy, with no breaks. The walls were too tall and smooth for easy climbing. Yet the footprints returned night after night, always larger than life, always bare, and always vanishing as if their creator had evaporated. Sleep deprivation and constant anxiety began to erode my sense of reality. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed dark circles under my eyes, a haunted expression that made me scarcely recognize myself. My muscles felt perpetually tensed, as though I was bracing for an unseen blow. At times I questioned if I was the one creating the footprints somehow, blacking out and wandering the yard. But my own feet were decidedly smaller, and I never woke with muddy soles or torn clothes. Still, I couldn't ignore the thought that maybe my mind was unraveling, twisting normal occurrences into a monstrous narrative. I half wished that I'd spot a neighbor pulling a prank, just to quell the gnawing fear that had taken root in my psyche. As the nights grew colder, the bar got quieter. Fewer customers meant earlier closings, leaving me alone in the building for longer stretches of darkness. The corridor lights flickered ominously, creating dancing shadows at the edges of my vision. My body would freeze at any slight movement in the periphery, a surge of adrenaline flooding my veins. One night, I was convinced I heard a low murmur, like breath or a whispered voice, right behind my apartment door. My heart hammered so forcefully that I pressed a hand against my chest, worried I might faint. I stood there, hardly daring to breathe, until my legs threatened to buckle. When I finally opened the door, there was nothing but the stale smell of old wood and the hum of the refrigerator in the bar's kitchen below. One particularly stormy evening, the wind howled fiercely around the building, and the rain battered the windows. The power flickered a couple of times, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Around midnight, lightning illuminated the yard. I was standing near my window, too restless to sleep, when a flash of light revealed a fleeting silhouette in the yard. Something tall, with broad shoulders, definitely upright. My vision blurred with terror, and I let out a sharp gasp that dissolved into ragged breathing. As soon as the light faded, the figure vanished. Another lightning strike revealed nothing but the old tables. In that moment, I felt as though my sanity was teetering on a precipice. My hands shook uncontrollably, and sweat slicked my forehead, mixing with the prickling sensation of raw, unfiltered fear. Though every instinct told me to stay inside, the compulsion to confront this presence was overwhelming. I grabbed an old flashlight I kept by the bed and hurried down the stairs, nearly tripping in the darkness. Outside, the storm pummeled the yard. Rain drenched me instantly, and wind whipped my clothes against my skin. I felt the mud sucking at my shoes as I stepped closer to the spot where I had seen the silhouette. Thunder boomed overhead, shaking the very walls. Then I saw them again, those footprints, even clearer now in the waterlogged ground. They were spaced in such a way that implied something had been pacing back and forth, as if waiting. Each imprint seemed deeper than before, suggesting a heavier, more forceful presence. My heart pounded so hard I could hardly breathe. Lightning flashed, and in its glare the footprints appeared almost to shimmer. I heard a scraping sound, a single wooden creak, impossibly loud amidst the storm. A surge of primal terror flooded me. I whirled around, shining my flashlight frantically across the yard. Between thunderclaps, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the thudding of my pulse. My vision blurred with rain and panic, and for an instant I swore I saw the outline of a figure looming by the fence. My flashlight flickered, and the shape vanished, leaving only shadows dancing in the corners of my eyes. Unable to bear it any longer, I scrambled back inside, locking the door behind me. My entire body shook as I climbed the stairs, my breath ragged and my clothing dripping onto the floor. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat with my back against the wall, adrenaline still coursing through me long after the storm had passed. I wanted answers, but the only thing I had was the echo of that thunder and the memory of footprints that shouldn't have existed. Eventually, I decided I needed a plan. I bought a cheap motion sensor light and installed it facing the yard from my window. If something stepped out there again, I hoped a sudden flash might at least scare it off. For a while, I felt marginally safer knowing I had taken some precaution. Yet the next time I woke to that familiar creak, I checked the yard from my window and saw nothing but darkness. My motion light did not trigger. Still, when I went down, the footprints were there, fresh and glistening with dew. It was as though whatever came into my yard managed to avoid the sensor entirely, walking just outside its range. The revelation chilled me to the core. It indicated a deliberate awareness, a cunning intelligence. On my final night in that apartment, I reached a breaking point. The same slow creak returned around 1 in the morning, crawling under my skin like a warning. My heart raced, and I felt an almost nauseating wave of anxiety. Determined to put an end to this, I rushed down to the yard, flashlight in hand, fear coiling in my gut like a snake ready to strike. The moment I stepped outside, I felt a suffocating presence, as though the air itself had thickened. The footprints were new, but this time they led in a faint arc toward a corner of the yard where the shadows were darkest. My stomach churned, and I had to fight back the urge to vomit from pure tension. Stepping forward, I raised my flashlight, my mouth so dry I couldn't swallow. In that corner, I saw a shifting darkness, something that felt like it was looking straight back at me. My flashlight flickered again, and for a fraction of a second, I sensed movement, a looming shape almost blending into the night, like a black cutout against blackness. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and I stumbled backward, my vision swimming. There was no voice, no hiss, but something about that presence screamed danger. I turned and bolted back inside, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. My mind reeled as I locked every latch I had. A sensation of raw panic coursed through my body, my hands slick with cold sweat. I stayed up the rest of the night, pressing my ear to the door, every muscle stiff with fear. Once or twice, I thought I heard soft scraping outside like fingernails brushing against wood, but the noise always faded before I could react. By dawn, I had made my decision. I wouldn't spend another night in that place. I packed my belongings haphazardly, stuffing clothes into a suitcase and throwing random items into boxes. With the first light of morning, I loaded everything into my car as fast as I could manage. My landlord had no issue with me leaving abruptly as long as I kept paying until a new tenant moved in. I didn't care. I just wanted out of that building, away from that yard, from those impossible footprints. I drove off feeling as though I was escaping a nightmare, yet the memory still lingers, curled in the back of my mind like a creeping vine that refuses to die. Even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced I hear a distant creak of warped wood. The image of those footprints remains vivid, the sheer size of them etched into my consciousness. Perhaps I'll never truly know what walked through that yard, or what might still be walking there when the moon is high and the rest of the world is asleep. But I do know this: some mysteries are better left unsolved, because once you've seen proof that your reality can be broken, the reassurance of locked doors and tall walls is never quite the same again. The aftermath is a cold dread that clings to the edges of your life, a persistent reminder that there are forces out there we can't always explain, and sometimes the only choice is to run before they sink their claws into us forever. The nights in my suburban neighborhood have grown oppressively silent, as though the darkness itself is holding its breath and waiting for something dreadful to surface. There is no comforting hum of distant traffic here, no gentle rustle of leaves to soothe the nerves. Instead, there is only that unrelenting scrape against the concrete of my backyard wall. It's a sound that claws at my ears and makes my stomach twist into uneasy knots. Each evening, I brace myself for it, hoping in vain that this will be the night it finally stops. I live in a modest, semi-detached house, with a narrow backyard enclosed by a tall, austere wall that separates my property from a vacant lot. When I first moved in, I didn't pay much attention to what lay on the other side of that wall. It was just an overgrown stretch of land, choked with thorny weeds and piles of discarded rubble. The lot was fenced off from the street, but the fence was rusty, leaning precariously to one side. The neighborhood rumor was that the owner had passed the property on to distant relatives who never bothered to maintain it. For the first few months, it remained nothing more than an eyesore in my peripheral vision, until the night I heard that sickening scratch for the first time. I remember I was sitting in the living room reading. It was late, and the room was oddly hot despite the cool breeze outside. Suddenly I heard it, faint at first, but impossible to miss once it registered in my mind. It sounded like long, sharp nails slowly raking across the concrete. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. My heart rate kicked up. I tried to tell myself it must be a stray cat, maybe rummaging through the weeds. Yet that noise was too deliberate, too unsettling to simply ignore. It echoed across the bare walls of my yard and seemed to pulse in my ears even after it stopped. The next day, I decided to investigate. I checked every inch of the concrete wall in my backyard, running my fingertips over its rough surface, hoping to find claw marks or scratches. But there was nothing. No scuff, no strange marking, no hint that an animal had ever been there. I even looked for paw prints on the ground. The soil by the wall was soft from recent rains, so footprints would have been easy to spot. Still, I found none. It unnerved me, but I tried to push the thought from my mind. Perhaps I had heard something else. Some normal neighborhood noise distorted by the wind or my own imagination. Yet the scraping became a regular nightly occurrence. Sometimes it started around midnight, other times closer to dawn. No matter when it began, it never lasted long enough for me to gather the nerve to go outside and catch it in the act. And each time I heard it, I felt my chest tighten, my palms moisten with sweat, and my breath come in short, sharp bursts. I would lie in bed in the darkness, counting heartbeats, bracing for the moment the noise would start again, and the dread that came with it. I tried to mention the sounds indirectly to a friend over coffee once, testing the waters to see if anyone else in the neighborhood had noticed something similar. They shrugged and said they'd heard nothing unusual themselves, but suggested I might have rats scurrying around. Rats can gnaw through almost anything, they remarked, and I nodded politely while feeling this deepening pit of unease in my stomach. Rats, cats, or even raccoons are plausible pests, but I kept returning to the odd reality that there were no tracks or holes. It made no logical sense. As the weeks wore on, my nerves frayed. The nights felt stifling, and I found myself straining to hear the faintest sounds from outside, unable to sleep. The house, once my sanctuary, began to feel sinister. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to quiver with unseen life when I turned my head. The wind rattling the shutters at night made me break into a cold sweat. I almost convinced myself that I was teetering on the edge of a panic disorder. Yet each time that scraping noise drifted over the wall, I was pulled back into the same primal fear as before. There was something there. Something intangible, perhaps, but definitely not just my imagination. Eventually, I decided I had to take matters into my own hands. I bought a powerful flashlight, the kind that can cast a beam over long distances. My plan was simple. The next time I heard the scraping, I would slip into my yard, quietly aim the flashlight over the wall, and see for myself. For several nights, I waited in growing anticipation, clenching the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached. The scraping would start. I would jump out of bed, rush to the back door, and sprint to the wall, heart hammering. But each time, the noise ceased right before I could shine the light. The backyard would be silent, except for the rustle of my frantic breathing. One night, as my patience was wearing thin, I heard it again, slow, grating, more deliberate than ever. I yanked open the door and bolted to the wall with the flashlight. My breathing was ragged, and my shirt was clinging to my body with cold sweat. For a split second before I lifted the flashlight, I sensed movement on the other side of the wall. It was a subtle shift in the darkness, a hint of something. Mustering my courage, I raised the beam of light. That was when I saw a dark shape pull back, almost as if it had crouched or sunk into the ground. My breath caught in my throat. It was so quick that I might have dismissed it as a trick of the beam if I hadn't felt the hair on my neck stand on end, as though I was being watched. All I caught was the faint outline of something vaguely human-like, but not quite. Then there was nothing. Only the silent, overgrown lot beyond. No footsteps, no rustle of plants, just an emptiness that pressed back at me with suffocating intensity. Despite my heart pounding like a drum in my chest, I refused to leave it at that. I needed more conclusive answers. So in a moment of wild determination, I climbed the wall and dropped into the vacant lot. The ground on the other side felt spongy under my feet, littered with damp leaves and tangled weeds. The air smelled of rot, like leaves left to decay in shadowy corners. My skin prickled as I played the flashlight over the debris. Old beams of wood, crumbling bricks, patches of tall grass. Yet nothing moved. No creature scurried away. The lot was utterly still, and that stillness weighed heavily on me. It was as though the place had swallowed its own sound. I forced myself to walk further, each step feeling more like an intrusion into forbidden territory. The deeper I went, the more I became aware of how my own breathing bounced back at me in short, tremulous echoes. The beam of light danced across twisted metal scraps and half-buried garbage bags. I nearly tripped on a broken chair leg. My pulse throbbed in my ears, loud and fast, and my entire body felt electrically charged, ready to lurch in any direction at the slightest noise. Yet the night remained silent. Finally, after circling the perimeter and finding no evidence of burrows, hideouts, or any place a large animal could nest, I decided to turn back. The sense of being watched, however, was overwhelming. My skin felt hot and clammy. My heartbeat sounded like thunder inside my skull. I thought for sure something was behind me. Every so often I'd spin around with the flashlight, certain I'd see that dark shape looming over me. But there was nothing but emptiness. Climbing back over the wall into my yard felt like a small victory, though it was punctuated by an unnerving hollowness. I had not found what made that noise, yet I was convinced I had seen something. I slept fitfully that night, dreaming of scraping sounds that grew louder and more desperate, as though something was trying to claw its way into my house. In my dream, the walls bent inward, the foundation shuddered, and a black shape slithered just beyond reach. In the following days, a new tension settled in my home. I began to see movement in my peripheral vision. At first it was fleeting, like a swirl of shadow near the edges of my sight. But soon it seemed more insistent. While making dinner, I would catch a dark reflection by the kitchen window. When I turned, there would be nothing but my own face in the glass. While watching television in the living room, I'd sense motion just behind the curtains. My heart raced each time and my breathing would turn shallow, my mouth going dry as though all moisture had been sucked from the air. I told myself I was spooking my own mind, but the dread refused to release its grip. The nights were worse. I would lie awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening for that scraping. Sometimes it came, other times it didn't. Each time it did, the terror felt more personal, more invasive. I'd press my ear against the bedroom wall, trying to pinpoint the exact source of the sound, but it seemed to move, drifting from one corner of the yard to another. Once or twice, it even sounded like it was right outside my bedroom window, though I knew that side of the house was blocked by a tall fence. My chest would tighten, sweat would trickle down my temples, and I would feel that suffocating awareness that something on the other side of the wall was listening back. My sense of time blurred as I found myself unable to concentrate on work or social obligations. When coworkers asked me why I looked exhausted, I gave vague explanations about insomnia and stress, never admitting the bizarre circumstances. But their puzzled expressions made me feel even more like an outsider to normal life. I started questioning my own sanity. The question pounded in my mind: was I creating this nightmare out of my own fears? Yet the memory of that dark shape dipping out of sight remained vivid, accompanied by the gnawing suspicion that what lurked beyond my yard was neither mere animal nor figment of imagination. One particularly suffocating evening, I lost power. A sudden outage plunged the house into darkness. Normally, I would have shrugged it off as a neighborhood glitch, but that night, in the stifling blackness, my pulse hammered with an almost painful intensity. The silence was so absolute that I could hear blood rushing in my ears. Then, as if on cue, the scraping began. It was louder than I had ever heard before, drawn out, and full of a terrible purpose. My stomach twisted, and I could hardly breathe. Groping for my flashlight, I stumbled through the living room and out the back door. The yard was pitch black, and the air felt thick, like a suffocating blanket. My flashlight flickered weakly. Of course, it had to fail me at that moment. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to get inside and lock the doors, but a surge of defiance overcame me. The scraping had grown so relentless, and I had grown so tired of the helplessness. So I walked to the wall, sweat pouring down my face, my free hand trembling so severely I had to grip the rough concrete to steady myself. There, through the fickle beam of the dying flashlight, I glimpsed something that nearly made my knees buckle. A tall, spindly silhouette rose just on the other side, barely visible against the faint glow of distant streetlights. It seemed to be pressing its limbs, or appendages, against the concrete, causing that nightmarish scraping. My mouth went bone dry. My pulse hammered so powerfully that my vision blurred momentarily. I expected it to dart away, as it had before, but this time it just remained there, looming in a disturbing stillness, as though daring me to face it. The flashlight flickered again, threatening to die completely. In that split second, I saw a sudden movement, a fluid, almost unnatural shift in the figure's posture. Its head, or what I took to be a head, inclined slightly toward me as if acknowledging my presence. My entire body went cold, and I realized I was holding my breath. The scraping stopped. A hush fell over the yard, more suffocating than any noise could have been. In that moment, all the fear, all the dread I had felt for weeks reached a crescendo. I forced air into my lungs, my breath rasping in my throat. With my heart hammering like a desperate drum, I did the only thing I could think of. I banged my fist against the wall in a feeble attempt to break the paralyzing tension. The silhouette twitched, then melted back into the darkness. I heard what sounded like a low, guttural scrape along the ground, and then utter stillness resumed. Shaking all over, I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. An uncontrollable shiver rippled through me. It was as if the temperature in my yard had plummeted, though I was drenched in perspiration. Clenching my jaw to stop my teeth from chattering, I swung the flashlight over the top of the wall. Nothing. The vacant lot behind it was once again a silent void. No footprints, no rustling in the weeds, just the same disorienting quiet. I retreated to my house, barricading the door with a heavy chair, as if that could stop whatever lurked beyond. My hands were clammy, and my breathing was so uneven I feared I might pass out. For hours, I sat in the darkness, back pressed against the wall, flashlight in hand, waiting. But the power eventually returned without fanfare, and no further sound disturbed the night. Something changed in me after that. I felt certain that what I had seen was no ordinary intruder. I questioned my perception, but the stark memory refused to dim. The sense of oppression in my own home became unbearable. The corners of each room seemed to quiver with residual energy. Every reflection in a mirror or window threatened to reveal a shape lurking behind me. My paranoia was relentless. I started to see my own shadow as alien, elongated, out of place. Sleepless nights blurred into one another. My heart raced at odd moments, and I startled at the slightest noise, convinced it was that infernal scraping starting up again. Finally, after several days of suffocating dread, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait around to see if that thing, or whatever it was, would decide to push past the wall for good. In a streak of raw desperation, I packed a duffel bag with essentials. I told a neighbor that I needed some time away and would be staying with a friend out of town for a while. They asked if everything was all right. I said I was just burned out and needed a change of scenery. Inside, my pulse thrummed with tension, and I suspected they could see the strain in my eyes. That same evening, just before sunset, I gathered my courage and stepped out into the backyard one last time. I wanted to see if the air felt as heavy as before, if there was any sign of that dark shape returning. The sky glowed with shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the concrete. My mouth was dry and my stomach churned as I stood near the wall, trying to muster some sense of finality. A breeze rustled the weeds in the lot beyond, but I heard no scraping. Instead, I felt a profound unease, as though something invisible was peering at me from behind that barrier, letting me know it was still there. I didn't stay long. My heart was pounding too hard, and a cold bead of sweat traced its way down my temple. Without a word, I turned on my heel and went back inside to grab my bag. Before leaving, I locked all the doors and windows, even though I had little faith such barriers could stop something that moved with such eerie silence. I climbed into my car and drove away, watching in the rearview mirror as the house grew smaller, my mouth set in a grim line. My jaw ached from clenching, and my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I've been away for a while now, crashing on a friend's couch. Sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, I wake to phantom echoes of that scraping sound. My heart will pound, and I'll stare at the ceiling, recalling every horrific detail. I keep remembering that fleeting silhouette, the unnatural way it shifted its posture as though it was studying me. I don't know if I will ever truly believe my own recollections. Part of me wonders if it was all some stress-induced hallucination, a potent mixture of fear, isolation, and the oppressive quiet of my neighborhood. Another part of me suspects there really is something lurking in that vacant lot, something that takes a perverse pleasure in tormenting those who dare to listen. I can't shake the notion that if I ever go back and settle into my old routines, the night will bring that scraping again, slow and deliberate, gnawing away at my sanity. The worst part is the lingering, unshakable feeling that I was being observed, studied by something beyond my understanding. Even miles away, I sense it sometimes, as if the distance doesn't matter. That intangible entity might be tied not to the place, but to the fear itself. It might be waiting for the right moment to reappear, just at the edges of my vision, to remind me it's still out there. And as much as I try to silence the thought, the terror festers in the back of my mind. Because if I close my eyes and hold my breath, I can still hear that scrape against the concrete, slow and cruel, in the dead of night. The hallway lights flickered as I stepped off the elevator, washing the silent corridor in a pallid glow that made the shadows look unnervingly alive. My pulse throbbed in my temples before I took another step. There was something about being here after hours, when the bulk of my colleagues had long since gone home, that never ceased to unsettle me. I told myself it was just my imagination, a result of too many nights staring at flickering code and dealing with system updates when my mind was already exhausted. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else prowled these corridors, something that deliberately stayed just outside my field of vision. I work in IT at a company housed in a tall, nearly windowless office building. By day, it's abuzz with the typical clamor of ringing phones, tapping keyboards, and the hum of conversations that weave in and out. But after sundown, that same space empties out until it feels almost abandoned, an artificial cave lit by buzzing fluorescent panels. The quiet intensifies every little noise, the faint click of an HVAC system turning on, the metallic hum of the vending machine down the hall, even my own breathing. Over the past few weeks, my responsibilities have kept me here later than usual, long enough to see the building in its most desolate state. And in those moments, I began to notice movement at the corner of my eye. Nothing dramatic, just a brief flash of someone slipping by in the periphery. Every time I turned my head, I found empty corridors, silent cubicles, and rows of darkened desks. My first reaction was to assume it was another coworker stuck working late. In IT, it's not uncommon to see folks from different departments pushing through deadlines. But I quickly realized I was often the only soul listed on the security sign-out sheet at that hour. It wasn't that I wanted to believe in ghosts or something supernatural. Rationally, I figured it had to be one of two things: either a trick of my tired mind or a problem with my eyes adjusting poorly to the flickering lights. Still, every time it happened, a surge of cold dread spiked through my veins, making my chest tighten and my palms sweat. One night, I was installing a major update on our internal systems. The building was so quiet that my own footsteps on the carpeted floor made me feel self-conscious. I'd decided to grab a cup of coffee from the pantry area to keep me focused. As I passed a row of unoccupied desks, I could have sworn I spotted the silhouette of a person sitting in front of a computer on the far side of the open-plan room. The outline was faint but unmistakable, illuminated by a bluish glow, like the light from a monitor. My stomach twisted. Nobody was supposed to be there that late, especially not in that specific row of desks, since it belonged to a team that mostly worked regular business hours. I paused, heart rate accelerating to a heavy thump in my ears. The shape didn't move, but I felt a nauseating certainty that it was aware of me. It's impossible to articulate that sensation in logical terms. It was purely instinctive, a primal understanding that I was being watched. Summoning the nerve to approach, I forced myself to breathe slowly. My shoes felt heavier with each step, and an uncomfortable prickle of heat spread across the back of my neck. The overhead lights flickered again, giving the entire area an unnerving strobe effect. As I advanced, the bluish glow seemed to dim. When I finally reached the desk, the chair was indeed facing the computer, as though someone had just been sitting there. But it was empty. The monitor, far from being on, was completely off. In fact, Its power cord wasn't even plugged into the outlet. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest. Then I spotted a slight reflection on the dark screen, my own pale face staring back at me, eyes wide and brows furrowed in confusion. A sheen of sweat coated my forehead. It was as if I'd had a brush with something intangible. Adrenaline coursed through me, and every nerve in my body screamed that there was more to this than a simple trick of the light. Deciding to verify whether I was losing my mind, I went to the security office. The night guard, an older man who typically busied himself by watching TV on a small set beside the monitors, seemed surprised to see me approach so late. He asked if everything was okay. I replied, my voice as steady as I could manage, that I thought I saw someone else on the floor, but I wasn't sure. The guard checked the surveillance recordings from that exact time window. There was nothing on the footage, no sign of anyone near the desk I'd described. My own figure appeared briefly, passing in front of the camera, but beyond that, the entire floor remained silent and vacant. I left the security room feeling both relieved and disturbed. I'd confirmed there was no living person sitting there. Yet, that knowledge made the experience even more unsettling. Now I was left to ponder whether my overtired brain was conjuring illusions, or whether there was a presence in that office that defied explanation. From that point on, focusing on my work became a challenge. Every so often I felt a prickling at my scalp, as though cold fingertips were grazing my hairline. I would hear faint noises, clicks, taps, and the distant hum of electronics turning on and off in erratic rhythms. Sometimes the overhead lights would flicker in a pattern that seemed intentional, like Morse code from beyond. My eyes began to dart toward any subtle movement in my peripheral vision. Each time I jolted as though I'd been caught off guard in a dark room by a swift, silent intruder. When I turned my head directly, there was never anything but emptiness. One particularly tense evening around 9 o'clock, I was alone again. My desk lamp provided the sole beacon of brightness in a sea of muted gray cubicles. The rest of the ceiling lights had been turned off by maintenance, leaving only a few emergency lights glowing faintly. I was coding, eyes flickering between my screen and a debugging console, when I heard a gentle shuffle somewhere behind me. It was soft, like a single footstep on carpet, my lungs clenched in response. I slowly spun my chair around, every muscle coiled and shaky. The corridor was empty, but the air felt impossibly still, as if it were holding its breath along with me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to calm the thunder in my chest. My coworker from earlier had told me that this building had once housed a different company, many years before we moved in. He'd mentioned, in a half-joking manner, that old employees still roamed the halls, in spirit. Of course, I had brushed that off as an urban legend, but at that moment, the recollection of his words sent a chill racing through me, producing goosebumps that extended from my arms to the back of my neck. The bizarre occurrences escalated over the next few nights. On more than one occasion, I returned from a short break to find my computer locked, or an application closed as though someone had sat at my station in my absence, even though I'd made sure to leave everything running. The building's cleaning crew had already clocked out, so they couldn't be the explanation. When I asked them indirectly during daytime hours, they insisted they never touched active computers. I nodded, but inside my doubts sharpened into a quiet panic. I took to triple-checking my settings, securing everything meticulously. Still, mysterious changes and signs of activity persisted, leaving me on edge. My body began to show the strain of constant vigilance. My heart felt perpetually lodged in my throat, and my breathing grew shallow whenever I heard a suspicious sound. My skin would prickle with cold sweat at random intervals, as though the temperature in the room had abruptly dropped. Often, I found my hands trembling as I typed, forcing me to backtrack and correct errors. The dryness in my mouth left my tongue feeling thick and useless, so I'd sip water almost obsessively, yet it never quenched the underlying thirst. Anxiety gnawed at me relentlessly, and I found it nearly impossible to separate genuine sensations from trickery of the mind. Around that time, I started to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. I considered the possibility that the stress of late-night work, combined with excessive caffeine intake and insufficient sleep, was breeding hallucinations. Maybe my psyche was manifesting phantoms out of sheer exhaustion. Still, the consistency and vividness of each experience made it hard to dismiss as mere illusions. Something was tangibly affecting the electronics. My locked computer, the flickering lights. Even the feeling of being watched was too persistent to ignore. At one point, I recall leaving the office earlier than usual, just after 8, which felt like a concession to fear. On my way to the elevator, the overhead lights dimmed significantly, as though someone had adjusted the brightness. My footsteps echoed oddly, as if the corridor had grown longer. A chill breeze touched the back of my neck, even though the air conditioning was off by that hour. I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I would catch a glimpse of whatever had been stalking my peripheral vision. Nothing. But the hair on my arm stood on end, and my heart hammered so violently that I could feel it reverberate in my throat. That entire night, once I finally got home, I kept expecting to see a dark figure standing in the corner of my bedroom. Sleep offered little reprieve. My coworkers noticed the changes in my demeanor. They asked if everything was all right, pointing out I looked jumpy. I told them I'd been under a lot of pressure with deadlines. One of them asked if I'd thought about taking a few days off. I responded in a roundabout way that a vacation might be necessary soon, though I left out any mention of the strange sightings or the ominous presence I felt creeping around me every night. It felt too ridiculous to say out loud. Nevertheless, the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense the feelings became. I started hearing faint murmurs, like distant whispering in an empty room, whenever I walked by the rows of cubicles at night. The mechanical hum of the office equipment took on an uncanny resonance, almost like a distorted chorus. At times, the water cooler gurgled ominously, snapping me out of what little concentration I had. Even the clacking of my own keyboard began to sound dissonant, jarring my nerves in ways I can hardly describe. It was as if the entire building were conspiring to unravel me. One evening, I decided I'd had enough. There was a crucial update that needed to be done, requiring me to stay late yet again, but I resolved to face the corridor where I'd first glimpsed that elusive presence. Clutching a flashlight in one hand, even though the hallway lights were technically on, I ventured down the main corridor that led to a cluster of empty conference rooms. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my rib cage. My breath came in uneven spurts, and a thin film of perspiration glazed my forehead, despite the frigid air conditioning. As I advanced, I could feel that nagging sense of being watched intensify. The corridor seemed longer than usual, distorted somehow, as if the perspective itself was shifting. I heard faint scraping sounds that could have been chairs moving on the floor inside those dark conference rooms. The door to one of them stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. My throat constricted. Every instinct told me to turn around, to leave immediately, but I pressed on. Inside that conference room, I found only a table, a few chairs, and the blank screen of an unplugged monitor. Yet, something still felt deeply wrong. I shone the flashlight across the walls, half expecting to see a shadow flit across the far corner. My chest tightened when I heard a series of soft clicks, almost like the quick tapping of a keyboard. The sound echoed behind me. I pivoted, shining the flashlight into the hallway. Again, no one there. A surge of frustration and fear coiled in my stomach. I felt like I was chasing a ghost, or perhaps something even less tangible. My breathing accelerated, and a tremor ran through my fingers, making the flashlight's beam wobble. I felt a sinister presence creeping up behind me, something intangible but weighted, as if the air itself had solidified into a malevolent observer. Without thinking, I spun around, shouting that if someone was there, they needed to show themselves. My voice rebounded off the walls, sounding foreign and desperate in the stale office atmosphere. Silence answered me, thick and suffocating. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. My nerves on edge, I fled back to my desk. Every step felt like a marathon, each heartbeat a raw jolt. Once seated, I tried to steady my trembling hands on the keyboard. My eyes flicked to the clock in the corner of the screen, 10:15 p.m. I resolved to finish my task as quickly as possible and get out. I managed to complete the update around midnight. By then, the tension had coiled in my spine like a twisted spring. I logged off and shut down my computer, determined not to look over my shoulder as I walked to the elevator. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure it would give me away if anything was lurking nearby. Entering the elevator felt like stepping into a coffin. The doors slid closed with a final sounding clank. The ride down was excruciatingly slow. My thoughts were a blur of dread, relief, and lingering paranoia. When the doors parted at the lobby, I practically stumbled out. The security guard gave me a concerned look. He asked if I was all right, and I mumbled that I was just tired. He then mentioned, in a careful tone, that the cameras had picked up some strange anomalies over the last hour. Minor flickers and glitches. When I asked him indirectly if they caught anything that looked like a person, he simply shook his head. The expression on his face suggested he knew I was troubled, but wasn't sure how to address it. I left the building with an unshakable sense that something was watching me go. Since that night, I've tried to avoid late shifts whenever possible. Yet the memory of that presence lingers in my mind like a vivid stain. Even in daylight, I sometimes catch a hint of movement near the edges of my vision. It's enough to remind me that what I experienced might not stay confined to night hours or empty office corridors. I occasionally wonder if it's attached to me in some way, feeding on my unease. The tension in my chest returns whenever these thoughts strike. My breathing becoming shallow, my skin clammy. I haven't told anyone the full story. I doubt they'd believe me, and part of me wishes I could dismiss it all as mere stress-induced paranoia. Yet I can't deny that, in the darkest hours of those endless nights, I felt something brush against the boundaries of my reality, a shadow of a person, or perhaps a longing spirit that never left. I don't know if it was a fragment of my psyche unraveling under pressure, or if our office building harbors an unseen occupant. Whichever the truth, the nights I spent there changed me. On the rare occasions I do have to stay late again, I'm hyper alert. I keep the lights on as much as possible, and I make sure to take regular breaks in well-lit areas, never lingering too long in the corridors. Still, that sense of being watched hasn't gone away. Each time I catch movement in the corner of my eye, my stomach drops, and my pulse spikes. My mind races with the possibility that the next time I turn around, I won't be greeted with empty air, but with something real, something that I might finally see in full. Even now, I can't decide what would be worse, learning that my exhausted mind created a phantasm, or confirming that some entity truly roams those halls at night, defying all logic. I haven't made any definitive discoveries or exorcised any lurking spirit, but I do know this. The office after hours feels undeniably alive in a way no building should. There's a hush that's not exactly silence, a pulse of static in the darkness, and a sensation that corners are never truly empty. Sometimes it's just me, and something else, lingering unseen, waiting for that inevitable moment when it catches me off guard. The thought keeps my heart pounding well into the small hours of the morning, long after I've locked up and gone home, leaving the corridors behind me. Yet, in some eerie sense, it never quite lets me leave. The moment I stepped out of my car that night, an inexplicable chill ran through my entire body, like someone had brushed an icy finger along the back of my neck. It was late, later than usual, and the parking lot of the gas station felt too silent, as if the surrounding darkness had swallowed every trace of warmth and light. My breath came in short puffs in the cold air, and I sensed a tension in my muscles before I could even take my first step toward the convenience store. I told myself it was just fatigue. After all, I had been working longer hours than normal, pushing my limits day after day. Still, something felt wrong. I had visited this gas station countless times. It stood on a lonely stretch of road, not completely isolated, but far enough from any major thoroughfare to be considered remote. For years, it served as my final pit stop on the way home, my chance to grab a quick coffee and decompress for a moment before finishing the drive to my house further out. Even though it was usually quiet, I had never found it ominous. But that night, the overhead lights flickered just a bit too frequently, and the hum of the fluorescent bulbs had a grating edge, as though they strained to keep the darkness at bay. The wind carried the faint smell of gasoline and damp pavement. It was an ordinary smell, but it made me uneasy. My routine was always the same. Park near the side entrance, walk straight to the store, fill a paper cup with black coffee, and maybe chat briefly with the clerk. I knew the frigid breeze outside would vanish once I was within those glass doors. But that evening, I heard a strange rustling sound behind the station. My heart gave a heavy thud, and I found myself pausing mid-stride. It sounded like someone was scraping something against the asphalt, a soft but deliberate drag. Glancing over, I noticed something, or rather, someone, near the old pumps that had been decommissioned for as long as I could remember. This man stood partially illuminated by the flickering overhead light, wearing a dark jacket that hung loosely over his frame. He was bending forward, seemingly hunched over an object on the ground. I strained to see what he might be doing, but his posture made it impossible to identify precisely. I considered calling out, but my voice seemed caught in my throat. A wave of irrational fear coursed through me, sending my pulse racing. I finally managed a quiet greeting, barely audible, more like a reflex than a genuine attempt to communicate. He never responded. He didn't even flinch. I tried to convince myself that maybe he had headphones on or simply didn't hear me. For a moment I considered approaching, but an uneasy feeling rooted me to the spot, urging me not to venture any closer. My stomach churned in an unpleasant swirl of anxiety, as if an invisible pressure was pushing down on me. Perhaps it was the gloom, or the flickering lights, or the exhaustion. Yet the sense that something was off tightened around me like a noose. I tore my eyes away, forcing my feet toward the store entrance, telling myself it was none of my business what he was doing. The automatic doors slid open with a jarring squeak, releasing a wash of artificial light over me. Inside, the space felt uncharacteristically claustrophobic. The humming of the refrigerators was louder than usual, and there was a faint, stale odor, as though someone had forgotten to clean up a spill. It vaguely reminded me of burnt coffee grounds and something metallic. The lights, overly bright, cast sharp shadows that danced in my peripheral vision every time I blinked. The clerk, a familiar face I had seen many times, gave me a cautious look. He appeared worried, as though he sensed my disquiet. He asked if I was okay, sounding genuinely concerned. I tried to dismiss the tension in my voice, telling him it had been a long day. When he persisted, I mentioned there was a man outside near the old pumps, describing the jacket and the stooped posture. The clerk seemed puzzled. He said he hadn't noticed anyone else pull in, and wondered if I might have mistaken a shadow or a trick of the light. His insistence that I was alone in that lot made my stomach lurch again, and cold sweat formed around my temples. My mind raced to justify the discrepancy. Maybe the man had parked on the other side of the building, or maybe he had walked. That stretch of road was still accessible to pedestrians, even if it was rare for anyone to wander there at that hour. Nevertheless, the clerk looked me over and asked if I wanted him to check outside. I shook my head in refusal. I didn't want to cause a scene over something that could just be a misunderstanding. My nerves were frazzled enough. I grabbed my usual coffee cup, filled it with steaming liquid that smelled of scorched beans, and tried to steady my trembling hand. That was when the clerk assured me one more time that there had been no other customers that night. His words filled me with a disquieting hollowness in the pit of my stomach. After paying, I stepped back outside and inhaled the cold night air, hoping it might anchor me. But out in the lot, everything felt even darker than before. The overhead lights were still flickering, and the gentle wind carried a faint squeal, maybe from a loose metal sign somewhere. I forced my gaze to the area behind the station. The man was gone. The place where he had stood, where I had witnessed that unsettling posture, appeared empty. There was no one. I walked around my car, peering into the corners and recesses. The battered old pumps were chipped and streaked with rust, silent and forgotten. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, nothing indicating anyone had been there just moments ago. My instincts shouted that I should leave. Yet curiosity nagged at me. and a part of me wanted to investigate further, maybe to confirm I wasn't imagining things. I found myself approaching the old pumps, coffee cup trembling in my grip. Each step seemed to grow heavier, and my heartbeat pounded in my eardrums. I noticed a patch of ground that looked slightly wet, dark and shiny. It might have been a simple oil stain, but it felt ominous under the pale glow of that flickering bulb. I crouched and touched it lightly with the tip of my shoe. It didn't spread like a fresh spill. It was sticky. My breath caught in my throat, and I swore I could smell something metallic. I pulled back, my heart hammering so loudly that I could almost taste my own fear. When I glanced around again, I had the acute sensation I was being watched. There was no one there, yet goosebumps rose along my arms. It was a bone-deep feeling, like an itch in my mind that insisted eyes were on me from somewhere unseen. My throat felt tight, and the coffee in my cup rippled slightly from the trembling of my hand. Finally, I hurried back to my car, practically throwing myself into the driver's seat. When I slammed the door shut, it felt like I was barricading myself away from some intangible threat lurking in the darkness. The drive home was a blur of paranoia. Trees loomed on either side of the road, forming twisted shapes that seemed to claw at the sky. Every time my headlights flickered across a reflective sign or piece of debris, I jolted, thinking I saw someone or something standing on the roadside. My mouth was so dry it hurt, and my knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I might see the outline of that same figure in the back seat. But the mirror revealed only the empty stretch of road behind me. There were moments when I thought I detected movement in my peripheral vision, only to find nothing. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was drenched in cold sweat. Inside my home, I tried to calm my nerves. I closed all the blinds, locked every door, and turned on every light I could. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me, like an invisible residue of dread that clung to my clothes. At times, I thought I heard faint scratching at the windows, but each time I checked, there was nothing. My heart wouldn't settle, and I wandered restlessly from room to room. Sleep felt impossible. The next day, I convinced myself it had to be exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. I told myself I had probably seen a vagrant or a traveler who had walked off quickly. But the sticky stain on the pavement, the unnerving reaction of the clerk, and my own gut-level terror stuck with me. I tried to continue with my routine, hoping familiarity would bury that memory. Yet every night since, I have found reasons to skip that gas station or stop earlier in the evening. I took different routes. I even switched to a different brand of coffee I could brew in the office. Still, the sensation of being observed never quite faded. One evening, about a week later, I had no choice but to return to that same station. Work had kept me late again, and every other shop along the highway was closed. My nerves prickled as I pulled in. The place seemed less welcoming than ever. The same overhead lights flickered, but I noticed another set of them had gone entirely out, leaving a portion of the lot bathed in near-total darkness. The wind had picked up, whistling a low, mournful tune. My breathing was shallow, and I felt a compulsion to park as close as possible to the entrance to avoid walking across that open expanse. Inside, the store looked bleak, as if the harsh fluorescent glare had grown more intense. The clerk on duty was different this time, an older individual I barely recognized. I felt uneasy as I poured coffee into a paper cup, the strong odor almost making me gag. My hands shook so much I nearly spilled the hot liquid. The new clerk asked if I needed anything else, but I responded that I was fine, my voice breaking slightly. A wave of chills washed over me. Something in my peripheral vision flickered. Maybe it was a shadow behind the snack aisle, or maybe it was my own reflection in a mirrored surface. My pulse quickened until I could barely keep my composure. As I stepped back outside, I instantly regretted my decision to return. The wind whistled through a loose metal sign, creating a wailing sound that made my nerves tingle. The corners of the building seemed to stretch out in strange angles under the half-lit canopy. Then I caught the faint silhouette near those same pumps in the distance. It looked exactly like before. a man in a loose jacket, bending forward, as though hunched over the ground. My lungs constricted in a surge of near panic. I froze in place, wanting to call out or rush back inside. Instead, I found myself stepping forward, transfixed by curiosity or dread or both. This time, I was determined to confront him, or at least confirm he was real. Yet each footstep resonated in my head like a drumbeat, reminding me how alone I was. My vision blurred around the edges, and I felt clammy, as if the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an instant. When I was about a dozen yards away, the figure seemed to straighten up and turn slightly, though I couldn't make out any facial features in the dim light. My heart hammered. The overhead lamp flickered out for a moment, plunging that small area into near-complete darkness. In that fleeting gap, I felt my chest tighten, and an acute sting of fear gripped me. When the light snapped back on, the man was no longer there. Just as before, the spot was empty. No footfalls, no echo, not even a whisper of movement. I stood paralyzed, every hair on my body standing on end. In that silent emptiness, I felt a presence behind me, like a current of cold air or an electric charge. I whirled around, nearly dropping my coffee, only to be greeted by nothing but the deserted parking lot. My sense of reality wavered. My hands began to tremble more violently, and the breath caught painfully in my lungs. It was as though my mind was short-circuiting, trying to reconcile what my senses were telling me. When I finally forced myself to move, I broke into a clumsy, unsteady run back to my car, my pulse thrumming so hard that I heard the blood rushing in my ears. The coffee splashed onto my sleeve, and the burning sensation hardly registered in my panicked state. Fumbling with my keys, I managed to get into my car. My fingers felt numb as I shoved the key into the ignition. It took 2 tries to turn the engine over, and every second felt like an eternity. Once the car roared to life, I drove away, tires screeching as I left that cursed place behind. Even now, I can't say with certainty what I witnessed. Was it a tangible threat? Some menacing stranger who lurks in the shadows of that lonely station? Or was it something entirely beyond human explanation? My sleep is fitful. I wake to the echo of scraping sounds in my dreams, heart pounding as if I'd run a marathon. In every dark corner of my home or office parking lot, I feel a watchful gaze, an unseen presence that never fully recedes. Sometimes I hear the faint squeak of metal when I'm alone in my garage, or catch fleeting glimpses of a hunched shape reflected in glass. Yet whenever I look directly, there's nothing. I haven't gone back to that station since. If I drive past it, I keep my eyes fixed on the road, refusing to glance sideways. There's a dread that settles in my bones at the mere thought of those pumps and the figure that vanished into the night. Part of me is terrified I might see him again. Another part is terrified I won't, and that the unexplainable will remain unresolved, eating away at my sanity bit by bit. To this day, I clutch my steering wheel more tightly whenever I pass any isolated gas station. The rational part of me wants to dismiss what happened as a trick of my exhausted mind. But there's a deeper sense of unease that lingers, gnawing at my thoughts. It tells me I encountered something that defies neat definitions, something that resides in the shadows, waiting. Whether it was real or an apparition, it left me forever changed, carrying a silent dread each time dusk sets in. I keep looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that crouched figure again. And in those moments of oppressive silence, when the wind howls and the streetlights flicker, I'm not entirely sure I won't. I remember the unsettling silence of that evening, as if it were carved into my mind. The stale air in the hallway felt heavier than usual, pressing down on my shoulders and seeping into my lungs. My pulse quickened the moment I turned the key in the front door. Even before stepping inside, I sensed something was off, a subtle violation of my personal space that made every nerve in my body stand alert. It was one of those moments when, for no logical reason, you just know you're not alone. even though no one should be there. When I finally pushed the door open, I felt a rush of anxiety swell in my stomach. I had no idea that this was only the beginning of an experience that would haunt my every thought. I moved into this apartment about a year ago with a friend, let's call him Alan, who worked in a field that often required sudden out-of-state trips. He always joked that if he ever had to leave for some urgent matter, he would leave a sign instead of telling me directly. The sign, he said, would be the bedroom windows thrown wide open in my room. I laughed it off the first time he mentioned it. He seemed half serious, half amused by the idea of a secret code that only the two of us would understand. It was a playful concept back then, a weird inside joke to bond over, but it later became a source of restless nights and unrelenting paranoia. Alan's room was down the hall from mine, and we both had our own personal space. My bedroom faced an old courtyard that never got much sunlight, so it stayed dim and cool throughout the day. The window was always closed, not just because I found the courtyard depressing, but also because the rusted latch stuck to the frame. It required a decent amount of force to pry it open. I rarely tried. Most times, I left it shut to block the stale smell that rose from the neglected alleyway below. So when Alan first told me about his signal, I responded with good-humored disbelief, remarking that it took near superhuman strength to open that window anyway. He just grinned and shrugged. Several weeks passed without incident, until one afternoon I returned from a quick trip to the market. The apartment was silent, but Alan was still around, busy rummaging through the kitchen cabinets. I headed toward my room to drop off a bag of laundry when I saw it. My window was open, wide open, letting in a gust of musty wind that made my curtains flutter. My immediate reaction was a mild annoyance. I stormed back into the living area and half-jokingly asked Alan if he was messing around with my sign. He told me he hadn't opened anything, nor was he planning to leave for any last-minute job. He looked genuinely puzzled. For a moment, both of us stared at each other in uneasy silence, acknowledging how bizarre it was. We did a quick check of the apartment. No locks broken, no footprints on the windowsill, no odd scratches near the latch. The confusion lingered in the air, but neither of us was ready to call it anything more than a fluke. Perhaps I had left it ajar earlier, or maybe a sudden breeze had somehow forced it open. We came up with a dozen trivial reasons for why that window might have been open. I caught Alan glancing at me with a hint of concern. He tried to lighten the mood by reminding me that if he truly had to leave in a hurry, he'd have told me through a text message at least. I forced a laugh, but my stomach churned. The moment felt more unsettling than I cared to admit, and a sense of vulnerability clung to me afterward. The next few days were relatively calm. My window stayed shut, and everything seemed normal. The apartment itself was a typical urban unit. Narrow corridors, inadequate lighting, and thin walls that allowed us to hear the neighbors' muffled conversations late at night. Despite the slight gloom, I normally felt comfortable there, especially when Alan was around. Then came the second incident. One evening after work, I turned the key in the lock and noticed an immediate shift in temperature as I stepped into the living room. A cold draft cut through the stale warmth. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it was coming from the hallway that led to my bedroom. I remember swallowing hard before I even touched my doorknob, anticipating what I would see. Sure enough, the window was fully open again. The curtains whipped back and forth in a steady rhythm, tapping against the wall with a dull, repetitive thud. My breath caught in my throat. A gnawing dread sank into my bones. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Alan had come home in the afternoon and left for a walk. But the more I looked at the old latch, the more I felt certain that something else was going on. That latch was stubborn at the best of times. It didn't just spring open on its own. Shakily, I took out my phone and called Alan. He picked up sounding surprised, telling me he was still in the city but hadn't been near the apartment for hours. I felt my entire body tense up. My heart hammered so violently that I thought I might pass out. Over the following days, the tension in our apartment became palpable. My imagination started to run wild at every creak, every subtle shift of light in the hallway. I began waking up at odd hours, drenched in cold sweat, convinced I heard footsteps pacing outside my bedroom door. Sometimes, I would jolt upright in bed, Sure, I saw a faint silhouette in the corner of the room, only to realize it was my own reflection cast by the dim glow of the street lamp through the blinds. My rational mind kept telling me I was overreacting, that I should just push these thoughts away, but my body wouldn't listen. My hands were constantly clammy, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end more times than I could count. The atmosphere changed in subtle ways too. Our living room felt darker, even with the same light bulbs. The shadows seemed deeper, elongated. I swore I could hear faint whispers in the corridor when I was home alone. On one occasion, as I was doing dishes late at night, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection on the window above the sink. It was just a fleeting shape that vanished the instant I turned around. Yet that single moment sent my heart into a frenzy. I leaned against the counter, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself it must have been a trick of the light or a passing car's headlights. But some primitive part of me felt watched, like a caged animal in the sights of a predator. Alan noticed the change in me, though he tried to handle it with a sense of humor. He made casual remarks about how I needed a break, or maybe a change of scenery. He mentioned that he might be leaving for a new work assignment soon, but hadn't received confirmation yet. He teased that if I really wanted to be alerted, he'd open not just my window, but also set off every alarm in the place. I forced a grin at his attempts to ease the tension, yet I couldn't shake the creeping dread that had settled into my bones. One weekend, Alan decided to spend a couple of days out of town to clear his head. Meanwhile, I stayed behind, clinging to the illusion that normalcy might return if I just confronted my fears in solitude. The first night he was gone, I tried to keep myself busy. I watched a mindless TV show, cooked a simple dinner, and made sure every window and door was securely locked. I even pushed a dresser in front of my bedroom window for extra reassurance. Despite my efforts, I couldn't sleep. Anxiety pinned me to my bed, making every slight noise an earthquake in my ears. My heart pounded so loudly that I was surprised it didn't wake the neighbors. At some point near dawn, I drifted into a restless half-sleep. I awoke to the sensation of intense cold, an almost unnatural chill. My mouth went dry. I could taste the metallic tang of fear on my tongue. The dresser was still against the window, but I noticed the faintest movement of air, a subtle rustle of the curtains behind the wooden frame. Gathering every ounce of courage, I approached the window. My hands shook as I slid the dresser aside. The latch was undone, though the window appeared shut. It was as if someone had carefully lifted the latch without opening the glass, like a prowler testing an entry point in slow motion. My pulse drummed in my ears, and my throat felt tight. I locked it again, pressing the latch until it clicked, then returned to bed, not daring to close my eyes for the rest of the night. By the time Alan returned, I was an exhausted wreck. I told him everything in hurried fragments, how the window's latch was undone, how I felt as though I was being watched every second. He gave me a look filled with concern, but also a faint, unsettling doubt. He reassured me that we should probably call maintenance to check the old latch or maybe install some additional security. He suggested that my anxiety was feeding on itself. I didn't argue. Part of me wanted to believe that a logical explanation existed for all these incidents. Maybe the entire apartment was just old, and the frames had shrunk from temperature changes. Maybe my mind had latched onto the idea of that signal and conjured up illusions. I desperately clung to these mundane possibilities. That night, we both tried to relax by playing some music in the living room. The apartment felt livelier with another person around, at least until the moment the lamp in the corner began to flicker erratically. Alan cursed under his breath, wondering if we needed new bulbs. But the flicker wasn't steady. It pulsed, and then went dark for a fraction of a second, as though someone had pulled the plug, only to glow again weakly. The shadows on the walls swayed, creating the impression of multiple figures crowding around us. I felt a wave of unease tighten my chest. A muffled scrape echoed from my bedroom. Alan froze. For a long beat, neither of us moved or spoke. I heard my heart thumping like a drum against my ribcage. When we finally mustered the courage to walk down the hallway, every step felt like wading through an invisible barrier of dread. My door was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of darkness opened into the room, revealing nothing but the silhouette of the bed. The air was suffocating, and I could almost taste the electric tang of fear in my mouth. I flicked on the overhead light. The window was open once more, the latch undone, the curtains swaying in a slow, mocking dance. My stomach churned violently, and a prickly sensation crawled across my scalp. Alan stood behind me, tense and silent, as though he finally grasped the weight of what had been happening. We spent the next hour double-checking every possible entry point, every closet, every inch of the apartment. Nothing was out of place except that window latch, hanging uselessly. By the time we finished, we were both drenched in sweat, our nerves shot. Alan made it clear that he was going to call his boss the next day to see if he could postpone any upcoming travel because he felt uneasy leaving me alone. He didn't say it outright, but the tension in his voice indicated he believed we were dealing with something beyond a simple break-in. Over the following days, the events took on an even more disturbing quality. Strange tapping noises echoed behind the walls at odd hours, like fingernails scraping. Light bulbs fizzled out faster than we could replace them. Doors that we had closed at night would be found slightly open the next morning. A creeping sense of dread followed me not just at home, but everywhere. My mind played tricks on me at work. I found myself glancing nervously at the office windows, half expecting them to swing open for no reason. Eventually, the oppressive air in that apartment became unbearable. After Alan confirmed he wouldn't have to leave immediately for his next job, I suggested we break the lease early. We agreed it was time to relocate, though we felt a twinge of defeat. It was as if we were surrendering to whatever was haunting those rooms. In a last-ditch effort, we had the maintenance staff inspect the entire window frame and latch. They found nothing structurally wrong, just some minor warping due to age. Despite that, the lead maintenance worker casually mentioned an unusual feeling in the room, a sense of something off that made him cut his inspection short. He wouldn't explain further, but his abrupt exit left me with a chill in my veins. I packed my things in haste, practically throwing items into boxes. Alan did the same, his usual composure gone. We decided to leave before sundown, driving to a hotel for the night. The tension in the air was suffocating as we walked out of the apartment for the last time. My heart pounded with each step, expecting some final confrontation, some last fleeting glimpse of a presence hidden in the shadows. But nothing dramatic happened. We simply left, leaving the key on the kitchen table as instructed by our landlord. The hallway outside our door felt strangely calm, as though it were mocking our panic. Even now, when I recall the final view of that empty bedroom, the curtains swaying in a silent breeze, a chill races down my spine. I never uncovered any logical explanation for the windows opening on their own. Alan stayed in the city, and we eventually found separate apartments in different neighborhoods. From time to time, we talk on the phone, recalling how ludicrous the whole situation seemed. But there's always a moment of uneasy silence when neither of us is willing to laugh it off completely. I still look over my shoulder when I hear a stray creak in the night. If a breeze rattles a window, my chest tightens. Sometimes I question whether it was truly something supernatural, or simply the product of a deteriorating apartment and overstressed minds. Yet part of me believes it was a warning, something beyond my understanding, making itself known in the only way it could. And that realization is what keeps me awake some nights, staring at the seams of my new window, wondering if I'll ever see it open by itself. Because now, whenever I sense even the slightest hint of cold air creeping in, my heart starts to race and my skin prickles with dread. It's a feeling that no amount of logic can banish, a constant reminder that some warnings, especially the ones we don't ask for, are best not ignored. I knew something was off from the moment I set foot in my new house. The air felt heavier than I expected, as if the walls held secrets I wasn't meant to discover. On that first day, when I stood in the living room surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, I already sensed a kind of presence. It was subtle, just a whisper at the back of my mind, but it made the hair on my arms stand on end. Somehow, I convinced myself it was just nerves. After all, moving can be stressful, and I was determined to settle in as smoothly as possible. Little did I know those quiet misgivings would soon grow into a suffocating terror. I hadn't even noticed the attic on my initial tour of the place. There was a small door in the hallway ceiling, with a retractable ladder that seemed sturdy enough. Several days after moving in, I finally mustered the energy to climb up and check the space. What greeted me was a surprisingly large attic, sloping rafters overhead, and a wood floor that creaked with every step. The single light bulb hanging from the center cast elongated shadows across the stacked beams and the corners piled with dust. The air was stale, cold, and unsettlingly still. My heart fluttered the moment I stepped onto the floorboards. It felt as though something was watching me from behind one of the dark piles of insulation. As I explored, I noticed a built-in piece of furniture along the far wall. It resembled a low dresser or a set of drawers embedded into the structure itself. A rusty padlock sealed it shut, and there was no sign of a key anywhere in the attic. I gave the lock a gentle tug, testing to see if it was loose, but it held firm. My curiosity flickered, but I wasn't about to break it open. Maybe it was a leftover from a previous owner, some long-forgotten piece of storage. I decided I'd ask a locksmith about it eventually, though there seemed no rush. I had other priorities, like unpacking and organizing the rest of the house. Over the next couple of months, I barely went into the attic. Each time I remembered the possibility of clearing out more space up there, I felt a weight in my chest that made me hesitate. I told myself it was just the dust and the cramped atmosphere. Still, every time I put my foot on that first rung of the ladder, I felt an irrational spike in my pulse. My palms became clammy, and that prickling sense of being observed would creep in. The feeling was persistent and unsettling enough that I simply stopped thinking about using the attic at all. Then came a day in early autumn when I felt compelled to revisit it. I was looking for a place to store some off-season clothes, so I figured it was time to make better use of the house's biggest hidden space. Right away, something was different the moment I poked my head through the attic entrance. The single light bulb swayed slightly, casting frantic shadows across the low rafters. There was no open window or any apparent draft, yet that bulb kept rocking as though someone had just brushed past it. My heart pounded. I paused, half in and half out of the attic, uncertain if I should go all the way up. Eventually, a kind of morbid curiosity pushed me forward. I noticed the built-in drawers across the room appeared slightly ajar. The padlock was hanging loosely from the latch, but the drawer itself was open by about an inch, no more. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches on the lock, nothing to indicate that anyone had tampered with it. That realization made my scalp prickle. Was it possible the padlock had always been loose and I just hadn't noticed before? I walked over to it, my breathing coming in quick, shallow bursts, each exhale a little louder than the last. I tried to pull the drawer open further, but it refused to budge. With a trembling hand, I attempted to move the padlock, but it was firmly attached. It didn't make sense. If the lock was still in place, how could the drawer have opened? A swirling sense of dread curled in my stomach, so I decided not to push my luck. I scurried back to the ladder and hurried down. For the rest of the evening, my mind replayed that image. The drawer, partially opened, an impossible configuration that had no logical explanation. I felt on edge, as though the walls themselves were pulsing with an unseen energy. I paced around my living room, occasionally glancing upward at the ceiling as if the attic door might open on its own. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize the situation. I thought perhaps the wood had warped, or a shift in temperature had caused the drawer to pop out a little. I considered the possibility that I might have tugged on the drawer during my first visit and forgotten. Still, the uneasy flutter in my gut wouldn't let me fully believe these mundane explanations. A part of me wanted to forget the attic even existed, but another part of me felt an inexplicable pull, a grim magnetism drawing me back up those rickety steps. The next time I ventured into the attic, I found the drawer padlocked shut again, exactly as on day one. This time it appeared entirely sealed, with no gap whatsoever. The realization made my chest tighten. Was it possible that I'd merely imagined it open before? My pulse throbbed in my temples, and cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck. I tried to tell myself it must have been a trick of the light, but the memory of that inch-wide gap was too vivid. I could still picture the gap's dark interior space. I had definitely seen something that day. After I descended, I mentioned to a colleague that my attic had a strange built-in piece of furniture locked up, and I couldn't find a key. I didn't give explicit details, mostly because I feared sounding unhinged, but I asked if it was common for older houses to have hidden compartments like that. My colleague shrugged and said that older homes often have quirky storage areas. He joked I should be careful not to disturb something best left alone. Even in his jest, I sensed a faint echo of my own anxiety. A chill crawled up my spine, and I realized I wasn't relieved by his reassurance in the slightest. The weeks went by, and the changes in the drawer position became more frequent. Sometimes I'd find it slightly open, other times locked tight. Once I discovered it pulled out almost halfway, though the padlock remained firmly in place. That was the day my heart pounded so fiercely I felt dizzy. I stood there in the attic, knees weak, breath stuttering, for a full minute before I regained the strength to move. My mind wrestled with the impossibility. How could the drawer be open that far when the lock was still latched? I started avoiding the attic altogether, but that sense of being watched began to seep into the rest of the house. Late at night, as I sat in the living room, I'd hear faint creaking above me, as though light footsteps were pacing across the attic floor. My throat would tighten, and my heart would beat a panicked rhythm. Each creak, each subtle thump, chipped away at my resolve. I'd stare at the ceiling, cold sweat beading on my forehead, imagining that padlocked drawer shifting by unseen hands. One morning, I woke up with an unmistakable sense that I hadn't been alone in my room. My sheets were soaked in sweat, and my breath came ragged as though I had run a marathon in my sleep. An unsettling notion took root. Maybe whatever was in the attic had found ways to reach me, even beyond that cramped space. My logic told me it was just nightmares, but my gut knew otherwise. My entire body was tense, muscles aching as if I'd spent the night bracing myself for some unknown threat. Despite my growing panic, a part of me refused to yield. I decided I would find a way to open the drawer once and for all. I reasoned that if I could see what was inside, maybe I could lay my fears to rest. Gathering my courage, I bought a small bolt cutter. The following weekend, I climbed the attic ladder with my throat tight and my palms leaving clammy prints on each rung. At the top, I flicked on the light bulb and nearly dropped the cutters in shock. The drawer was fully closed and locked tight, yet the entire piece of furniture seemed slightly shifted in the wall. The edges didn't line up as they had before, as though it had been moved and jammed back into place at an odd angle. Swallowing a lump in my throat, I carefully walked toward it. My heart hammered. I kept expecting something or someone to leap out from behind the boxes. Every board creak under my feet made me flinch. When I finally reached the furniture, I lifted the bolt cutter. My arms felt like lead, and I had to force myself to grip the handles. I placed the blades around the rusted padlock and squeezed. Nothing happened. I pulled with all my strength, my muscles trembling from the effort, sweat sliding down my temples, but the lock wouldn't budge. It felt like I was trying to snap solid steel, far stronger than anything that old rusted padlock should have been. After several attempts, I realized I was panting, my breath echoing in the hush of the attic. The lock remained intact. My knuckles had gone white, and my arms twitched from fatigue. In disbelief, I set the bolt cutter aside and exhaled in frustration. It simply made no sense. Any standard cutter should have sliced right through a lock that corroded. Suddenly, the light bulb above me flickered. A single burst of bright light, followed by darkness. Then a hesitant glow as it sputtered back to life. In that flash, I caught a glimpse of something behind me in the reflection of the steel cutter. It was just a quick silhouette, but it looked like a vague, human-like shape near the attic entrance. My stomach lurched, and a surge of adrenaline flooded my system. Spinning around, I found nothing but empty space. I stood frozen, chest heaving, goose flesh rippling across my arms. I could hear blood pounding in my ears as I stared at the spot, my eyes struggling to adjust to the flickering light. A few seconds passed in excruciating silence, and then the bulb stabilized. That was enough for me. I gathered the bolt cutter and scrambled back to the hatch. My legs felt like rubber, and I was terrified I might slip on the ladder. Once my feet hit the hallway floor, I slammed the attic door shut. My heart was racing so violently I could hardly breathe. I resolved in that moment to leave the attic alone for good. I'd pretend it didn't exist if that was what it took. I told a friend I had decided to board up the attic entirely, half joking that I was trying out a new minimalist lifestyle. Internally, I was desperate to never step foot in that place again. Yet even after I hammered some plywood over the hatch and placed heavy boxes on top for good measure, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there. In my restless sleep, I imagined the drawer sliding open behind the boarded hatch, a silent invitation to something beyond my understanding. In the daytime, I heard faint scratching sounds, soft but persistent, like nails on wood. My hands would tremble whenever I heard it, and my tongue felt dry in my mouth, as though every drop of saliva had turned to dust. I started to doubt my sanity. Maybe I was conjuring all of this from an overactive imagination, or maybe stress was finally wreaking havoc on my nerves. One night, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I peered through the peephole, no one stood outside. I felt a jolt of unreasoning terror, and my pulse thundered in my ears. Could that presence from the attic be moving beyond the confines of the house? Or was I letting paranoia eat me alive? I paced around, checking every window and corner, but found nothing unusual. Eventually, I slumped onto the couch, mind buzzing with suspicion. My entire body was on edge, like I was ready to spring into action at the slightest noise. Sleep was impossible. Around midnight, I swore I heard the faint click of the attic door above me, followed by a soft scraping, as if something was trying to pull the barricade away from inside. My mouth went bone dry and I began to shake. I lay there in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. Then the silence returned. I told myself I must have drifted into a half-dream, that my fear was playing tricks on my senses, but a deep, unshakable dread planted itself in my chest. By the time morning arrived, I felt utterly drained. My nerves were frayed and my hands shook with fatigue. I made a decision. I would leave the house for a while. I'd pack some essentials and spend a few nights at a hotel or at a friend's place. Anything to get distance from that attic. Before I left, I did one final check. The barricade over the attic hatch was still intact, though it looked marginally shifted, as if someone, or something, had tested it. My stomach churned with nausea. I hurried out, feeling a cold sweat gather beneath my collar. My head pulsed with tension, an almost painful throbbing that made every sound feel too loud. As I drove away, the house looked ordinary in the rearview mirror, its windows blank and silent. Anyone passing by would assume it was just another cozy home in the neighborhood. Yet I knew what lingered under that roof. Even now, thinking about it, my skin crawls. I can't say for certain if what I experienced was supernatural or the result of my own unraveling mind. Maybe both. But I do know I've never again felt truly safe in any attic, and the mere mention of a locked drawer is enough to make my heart race. I'm still grappling with what I encountered up there in that dusty, dimly lit space. The unnerving sense of being watched hasn't left me entirely. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I recall the metallic clank of that immovable lock, the glimpse of a silhouette in the flickering light, and the creeping knowledge that something was playing with my sanity. If I close my eyes, I can almost hear the drawer sliding open, just an inch at a time, inviting me back to see what lies inside. Even now, far from that house, the memory haunts me, clinging like a shadow I can't escape. In the end, I suppose I did escape physically, but a piece of my peace of mind remains trapped in that attic, with that impossible drawer that never needed a key to open. I first realized how the clang of steel could rattle not just the ears, but the very core of a person while standing alone in that dark, decommissioned factory. The place had been silent for months, or so they told me. Yet on my first night there, I caught the unmistakable echo of metal striking metal. In a moment, my pulse quickened, and a chill spread across my scalp. The factory was supposed to be nothing but an empty shell. Rusted machines, dusty corridors, and silence stretching out like a yawning cavern. But from that very beginning, I sensed I was not alone. I started working there after my previous job downsized. The position was straightforward: maintain the old machines stored in the facility and ensure security during the night. I was told it was a temporary post, a stepping stone before they decided what to do with all the antiquated equipment. The pay was reasonable, and the hours suited my schedule, though I was never fond of night shifts. As I arrived on my first evening, the main entrance loomed tall, a heavy steel gate flanked by massive brick walls that bore streaks of rust and graffiti. The structure exuded a tired, ominous presence. The night air was stale, carrying a faint hint of machine oil and old dust. My breath felt tight in my chest as I stepped inside. The interior corridor stretched into darkness. Overhead, lights flickered at intervals, each bulb encased in a metal cage that cast odd shadows across the concrete floor. My boots made a hollow thud with every step, echoing in the emptiness. Rows of dismantled machine parts lined the walls: gears, conveyor belts, and twisted metal frames. At one point, I stood before a giant press machine, its mouth open as though waiting to swallow some hapless victim, even though I knew no tragedies had ever been reported there. My mind played games, conjuring images I couldn't shake off. From the start, there were subtle hints that something was off. On my second shift, I heard a faint scraping noise coming from the far end of the building. It was slow, rhythmic, and oddly deliberate. My heart rate spiked. I paused, hand hovering near the flashlight on my belt, suddenly hyper-aware of every beat of my pulse. My breathing felt too loud in my ears. When I approached, I found nothing but a cold breeze drifting in through a broken window. Still, I thought I caught a glimpse of a chain swaying, just a slight motion in the dim light. As soon as I fixed my gaze on it, it went still. The nights that followed were heavier, more oppressive. Each time I patrolled the outer corridors, I noticed a new detail. A fresh set of footprints in the dust, a smudge on a once clean piece of metal, or a door left ajar even though I remembered locking it. I felt an inexplicable sense of being watched, as if someone or something lingered in the corners of my vision. Now and then, my skin would prickle, and a trickle of sweat would roll down the back of my neck. I tried to tell myself that old buildings settle, that air currents move things, and that I was overreacting, but the dread would not let go. In one indirect conversation I had with a coworker, he simply noted that the building had a history of making weird noises, especially after midnight. He suggested I keep my flashlight and radio close. He kept his tone casual, but I sensed a reluctance in his voice. It was as though he wanted to say more but chose not to. Feeling uneasy, I went to the manager, who assured me the building was perfectly safe. No one had reported any actual break-ins, and the old equipment, while spooky, was harmless. I nodded along, but inside I felt my stomach twist. Each time I tried to fall back on logic, that sense of being under watch only grew stronger. Things escalated the night I first heard the metallic pounding loud and clear in the back storage area, a cavernous space dedicated to stashing away the largest, most obsolete contraptions. I recall standing at the threshold, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The beam cut through the dusty air, revealing shapes of forklift crates, rusted chains dangling from the ceiling, and huge, hulking forms of machines draped in plastic tarps. The sound pulsed somewhere within that dim labyrinth. It was a repetitive clang, as though someone was systematically beating on a metal sheet. My mouth went dry, and my throat tightened until each swallow felt like a knife scraping down. With every clang, my heart seemed to lurch against my ribcage. I forced myself to move forward. The scuff of my boots against the concrete felt painfully loud. My flashlight caught the glint of a chain swaying gently. There was no draft and no apparent reason for movement. My chest tightened, lungs seizing as if starved for air. The clang stopped abruptly. An unnatural hush filled the space, and I felt my legs trembling. I stepped closer to the chain, close enough to see rust flakes flicker off it as it moved. Then, just as I thought I might convince myself it was a natural swing or something I'd triggered by stepping on a loose board, I heard a squeak behind me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight on empty space, but I sensed something had been there. After that, I struggled to sleep during the day. I'd wake in a panic, feeling as though I was in the factory's corridors, hearing echoes of clanging metal in my ears. In the mirror, my eyes became ringed with dark circles, and my face grew pale and drawn. My nerves were on edge. I tried to talk myself into believing these experiences were simply byproducts of exhaustion, stress, or an overactive imagination, but each subsequent shift seemed to confirm that something else lurked in that dead facility. A few nights later, I came across more unnerving evidence. I was doing a routine inspection, walking through a corridor filled with crates labeled with old machine parts. Midway through, I found a deep scratch running down one crate's wooden panel. It was thick, jagged, and fresh. Fine flakes of wood still littered the floor. As I examined it, my breath felt shallow, and I could almost hear my heart pounding in my ears. There were no animals large enough to cause such marks, and the shape didn't match any tool I recognized. My skin went cold, a wave of goosebumps rolling across my arms. Then there was the chain incident. One night, during the final rounds of my shift, I made my way into the same storage area. Everything was eerily still. Even my footsteps seemed muted on the concrete floor. My breath came in shaky draws as I swept the flashlight from side to side. Then I froze. A lone chain, one I had noted before for its rusted, twisted links, was swaying violently, as if someone had yanked it. A clang reverberated from somewhere high above. My stomach lurched, and adrenaline flooded my system so quickly I felt lightheaded. I recalled gripping my flashlight in a sweaty palm, my teeth clenched while a voice in the back of my mind insisted I run. Yet I stood there, transfixed. The chain moved in abrupt jerks, with no wind, no mechanical reason. It felt like the entire darkness of the place was concentrating on that one unnerving movement. When it finally stopped, silence thickened the air once more. My shoulders burned with tension, and the hair on my arms stood on end. I found myself swallowing repeatedly, trying to regain control of my breath. There was no logical explanation, yet I convinced myself to circle the perimeter, searching for anything that could have caused it. I found no footprints, no open windows, no mechanism connected to the chain. The sense of dread continued to gnaw at me. At times, I wondered if I was starting to hallucinate from lack of sleep. I tried to keep a level head, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the old building had a complex ventilation system, or shifting beams in the roof. But every time I rationalized away one incident, another would replace it, more intense and more disorienting than before. One evening, as I walked back to the office area to log my observations, I felt an acute sensation that somebody was right behind me. My ears buzzed with the rush of blood, and my skin broke into a cold sweat. My breaths were short and ragged. With trembling hands, I turned, half expecting to see a figure looming. Instead, there was only emptiness. Yet the feeling persisted, as if eyes were on me, tracking each step I took. The floor seemed to pulse under my feet, my perception warping with every blink. I told myself I was just paranoid, but that sense of imminent danger clung to me like a suffocating blanket. By the time I reached the small office area, my entire body was trembling. I sat down in the metal chair behind the desk, hearing the clank of its legs against the floor. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I willed my heartbeat to slow. In an indirect exchange, my supervisor said I should write a detailed report about any unusual sightings or sounds. I tried to articulate my experiences but ended up downplaying the occurrences, afraid I'd be written off as unstable or overly imaginative. Still, I confided that the place unsettled me. He told me to keep going for a few more weeks, suggesting I might just be adjusting to night shifts. But the following week, I reached my breaking point. I was walking past a row of old conveyor belts, the overhead lights flickering like the final frames of a dying film reel. My nerves were already frayed. The clang of metal erupted again, echoing so loudly that my ears rang. The echo seemed to bounce off the walls, intensifying until I felt trapped in a vortex of sound. A wave of raw terror surged in my chest. My vision blurred, and I fought the urge to drop everything and flee. Gathering the last shreds of my composure, I inched forward. The clang ceased as abruptly as it began. I saw in the gloom a shape. It was tall but not solid, and I couldn't quite make out its features. My pulse hammered, my throat constricted. For a moment I was sure I was imagining it, just a shadow cast by the flickering lights. Yet it appeared to move, shifting from one spot to another with a disconcerting fluidity. I blinked, feeling sweat sting my eyes, and when I opened them again, the shape was gone. The chain overhead rattled, as if something brushed against it. By then my stomach churned, and my legs felt unsteady. I knew I was near my limit. After that night, I demanded a meeting with my supervisor. I spoke in tense, hushed tones, describing the sounds, the swaying chain, the sense of a presence that defied any reasonable explanation. I emphasized that my nerves were frayed to the point where I feared an actual breakdown. The supervisor, looking at my drawn face and shaking hands, finally agreed to transfer me to a different section of the company. On my final night at the factory, I felt a mixture of relief and nagging curiosity. Part of me dreaded stepping foot inside for a final round, while another part insisted on seeing if anything else would happen, as if I needed closure. I walked the corridors more quickly than usual, casting my flashlight in wide arcs, every muscle tensed for the slightest disturbance. The building answered my presence with an uneasy hush, even though I picked up faint creaks and the whisper of metal joints shifting in the darkness. Nothing dramatic occurred. But somehow, that silence was almost worse. I felt the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for me to drop my guard. It never did anything more that night, but I left feeling as though I was stepping away from something that was never truly at rest. To this day, I can still feel the oppressive weight of that place when I close my eyes. Sometimes, I'll dream of walking through those dark hallways again, hearing the clang of metal reverberate through my skull. I'll jerk awake, gasping, my heart pounding like I'm still there, flashlight in hand, facing the intangible presence that lurked just beyond my sight. Even now, in my new position, I occasionally find myself looking over my shoulder at random moments, half expecting to see a chain swinging or a shadow shifting in the corner. I've come to realize that some places hold echoes of energies we cannot comprehend. Rational thought can only do so much when faced with the inexplicable. Whether it was a supernatural entity stalking those rusted machines or my frayed mind filling the silence with horrors, I can't say for certain. All I know is that the sense of being watched, that skin-crawling dread, felt far too real to dismiss as mere imagination. I never learned any official explanation. No one told me that a special inspection had found intruders, or that a hidden vent caused the chain to sway. It remained a mystery, locked away in that derelict building of metal and shadows. Though I managed to leave without any physical harm, the memory of that cold chain swinging in an airless room remains etched into my psyche. Sometimes, when I walk into dimly lit spaces, I can almost smell that stale, musty odor of dust and rust. My pulse will spike, and I'll swear I hear a distant clang echoing somewhere in my mind. The only closure I've found is the understanding that not all questions need clear answers. Some experiences, especially those that prey on our deepest fears, linger to remind us of our own vulnerabilities. That empty factory still stands there, filled with silent machinery and intangible secrets. I survived my time in its shadows, but a small part of me remains bound to the memory of that unseen presence, the unnerving clang of metal against metal, and the silent promise that some things are better left undisturbed. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up the moment I stepped through the rusted metal doors. The air felt heavy and stale, carrying an odor of decay that clung to my nostrils and slid down my throat like rancid oil. My flashlight beam trembled against the cold concrete walls as I slowly advanced, forcing myself to move forward, despite the vague, unspoken sense of dread coiling in my gut. For a moment, I thought I saw a faint glow on the far side of the main floor, but it winked out before I could focus on it. I had come here simply to assess the condition of an old industrial building, a routine part of my job in maintenance. Yet, even as I reminded myself of this mundane reality, an unsettling voice deep inside whispered that something in this place was profoundly and horribly wrong. I visited countless shuttered factories and warehouses in my line of work, most of them neglected for years, some for decades. Darkness, dust, and decay had become familiar companions, to the point where I rarely felt nervous. I have crawled through labyrinths of silent corridors lined with inoperative machinery, examined mold-stained walls and tested corroded pipes, all with a certain level of professional detachment. But from the moment I stepped into this particular building, that detachment was gone. My heart pounded a little too fast, and my breath hitched each time I inhaled the sour air. It was as though the building was breathing too, a shallow, rattling breath that only I could feel. I first noticed the flickering light in an upper window when I parked my van outside. The building was supposed to be entirely offline. Power disconnected ages ago. Electricity shut off at the main grid. Seeing that erratic glow dancing behind grime-smeared panes made my stomach clench. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps the wiring was faulty, or maybe someone had broken in and rigged a portable generator. Still, I couldn't help feeling that something was beckoning me inside, as though it knew I was coming. The main floor was a maze of half-disassembled conveyor belts, stacked crates, and neglected machinery covered in dust. My boots crunched on broken glass from overhead lamps that must have shattered years ago. Each step resonated in the emptiness, so loud that I found myself holding my breath, convinced that any sudden noise would alert something lurking in the shadows. The building swallowed my footsteps with an eerie echo, and I kept turning around, expecting to see a silhouette watching me from the darkness. But every time I checked, the corridor stood hollow and still. Eventually, I decided to head upstairs where I had seen the light. The stairwell was cramped and lined with flaking paint that peeled like dead skin. The overhead fluorescent tubes were coated in dust so thick that my flashlight could barely penetrate the gloom. I found myself hyper-aware of my own pulse, pounding against my eardrums, making it hard to distinguish external sounds from the rush of blood in my veins. Each footstep felt as though I was intruding on sacred ground, someplace not meant for the living. About halfway up, a loud clang reverberated from somewhere above. My grip on the metal handrail tightened until my knuckles ached. I paused, straining to pick out any familiar pattern. A mechanical hum, a hiss of air escaping from a pipe, some conventional reason for that sudden noise. Yet all I got was stifling silence. I tried to reassure myself, recalling how sometimes old buildings settle in strange ways or leftover debris shifts on its own. Deep down, though, logic was losing the battle against raw, creeping fear. When I reached the second floor, I paused in the stairwell entrance, scanning the corridor ahead. The door leading into that hallway was off its hinges, leaning precariously against the frame. Something smelled different here, a mixture of damp concrete and a metallic tang. I pressed on, stepping around shards of ceramic tile, ignoring the prickling sensation that told me I was being watched. The overhead lamps, if that's what they once were, hung by exposed wires. Occasionally, I heard soft clicking noises like nails tapping against a hard surface. But each time I pointed my flashlight in the direction of the sounds, I found nothing but dusty corners. The corridor was lined with windows on one side, but the layer of filth on the glass let in only a faint, greenish glow from the streetlights outside. The other side was a series of rooms formerly used for small-scale assembly, or at least that's what I gathered from the old signage. My job was to do a quick walkthrough, inspect major structural issues, and confirm that no one was trespassing. The place had been abandoned so thoroughly that I doubted I'd find much of anything. Yet I couldn't forget the light I had seen from outside. It couldn't have been my imagination. As I moved toward the far end of the corridor, I realized I was sweating. Even though the air was clammy and cold, my fingers were clammy too, slipping slightly on my flashlight. The more I advanced, the more intense my suspicion grew that something lurked just out of sight. I began to catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes flitting behind open door frames, or a quick ripple on the wall as though someone had walked past a distant light source. Each time I turned my head, I was greeted by a void, empty and silent. I thought about contacting my supervisor via phone to casually mention the odd phenomenon. But the idea of speaking out loud in that oppressive silence made me uneasy, as if the very act of acknowledging my dread would invite something to respond. Instead, I took out my phone and tapped a short message, indicating I was checking an upper floor and that I might need more time than expected. The signal was weak, but it went through. The building swallowed me in darkness, the gloom becoming almost tangible as I walked further down the corridor. Then the lights, those dusty overhead lamps that should have been powerless, flickered on in a sudden violent burst. At first it was so bright in contrast to the previous darkness that I winced, practically blinded. The fluorescence flickered erratically, casting wavering shadows on the walls and turning the corridor into a jittering nightmare. Adrenaline shot through my veins, and my breathing sped up. My heart thumped so hard it felt like it would leap out of my chest. Just as abruptly, the lights went out again, plunging me back into near-total darkness. I stood frozen for a few seconds, flashlight beam shaking in my grip. An uncontrollable trembling seized my hands, and I momentarily lost track of my thoughts. There was no rational explanation for the power surge. The building was supposed to be disconnected. Trying to calm myself, I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the frantic pounding of my heart as though I needed to confirm I was still alive. I took several shallow breaths, each one tasting like dust and fear. Swallowing hard, I continued down the corridor, forcing my feet to move despite the primal instinct urging me to turn around and run. One by one, I peeked into the rooms on either side. Broken desks, scattered papers, and the skeletal remains of old machinery greeted me. The faint smell of rust and mildew taunted my nostrils, but nothing seemed out of place. At least, nothing was obviously there that could account for the lighting phenomenon. My mind started to loop in paranoid circles, wondering if perhaps I'd come across a squatter who was playing tricks on me. But the more I looked, the more the emptiness convinced me that I was alone in the building, alone with something intangible, something that refused to show itself in ordinary ways. I reached the end of the corridor, where a metal staircase led to the top floor. Through the dusty window next to the stairs, I spotted the same flickering glow I had seen from outside. It beckoned me up, pulsating faintly. Every step I took on that staircase felt like a betrayal of common sense, as though some deeper survival instinct pleaded with me to turn back. My breath came in short bursts, my throat dry, and my palms were slick with sweat. I wondered if I was losing my mind. Could it be that the stress of the job was finally getting to me? Or was this building truly alive with some malicious presence? The top floor was a smaller space, consisting of a few offices that overlooked the assembly area below. The corridor here was narrow, and the windows facing outward were higher, letting in even less external light. The flicker that had guided me up was gone now. I scanned the walls with my flashlight, expecting at any moment to see a scuttling figure slip into the shadows. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, tightening my chest in a vice of raw anxiety. My heart hammered against my ribs, every pulse echoing in my temples. A sudden noise behind me, a faint scraping sound, made me spin around so fast that I nearly lost my balance. My flashlight beam swung wildly, illuminating chipped paint and a partially collapsed ceiling panel. But no one was there. My nerves were frayed, my muscles tense. My mind kept replaying that sound, as though it was searching for any rational explanation, but finding none. A cold sweat trickled down my back, beneath my jacket, and I wiped my forehead with a shaky hand. Stepping further in, I saw a doorway at the end of the hall that appeared slightly ajar. That was where the light had seemed strongest from outside. I approached it, feeling as though my own heartbeat was loud enough to wake the dead. An oppressive hush pressed in around me, broken only by the faint hum of my anxious breathing. With painstaking caution, I pushed the door open and aimed my flashlight inside. The room was empty. 4 walls of stained plaster, a single dusty window letting in a minimal glow. There were no lamps, no desk lamps, no overhead fixtures that looked operational, nothing that could have produced those bright flashes. The corners were piled with garbage, stray papers, and a toppled filing cabinet. A single metal chair lay overturned near the window, as though someone had left in a hurry. I stepped closer, shining the flashlight across the floor, searching for cables or any sign of a hidden device. My breath echoed loudly in my own ears, and my pulse thundered. Without warning, I felt a distinct brush of air behind me, like someone passing inches from my back. It was more than just a breeze. It had presence. I spun around, practically dropping my flashlight in the process. No one was there, of course, but the sensation was so vivid that I half expected to see an outline or a silhouette. My skin prickled and a wave of nausea hit me, my stomach twisting into knots. I tried to remind myself that old buildings can have strange drafts, but this felt intimate, deliberate. I stood still, shining my flashlight in slow arcs, determined to confirm that the room was empty. My hand was unsteady. The flashlight jittered, making shadows dance in sickening shapes against the walls. A low hiss of static seemed to fill my ears, or perhaps that was just the blood rushing through my head. I realized that tears had gathered at the corners of my eyes, probably from fear. I wasn't typically prone to tears, but there was something profoundly upsetting about feeling so powerless, so cornered by an invisible force. After collecting my wits, I forced myself to methodically check each corner of that room, moving debris aside with my foot. My breath was ragged, chest tight, each exhale sounding like a weak groan. I found nothing that could explain the fleeting lights or the tangible presence I had felt behind me. Feeling my sanity teeter, I decided I had done enough investigating. I wanted out. Walking back down the corridor felt different this time. The hush seemed charged, like the air crackled with malicious energy. My hearing felt hypersensitive, and I swore I could detect faint whispering, too soft to parse words. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, accompanied by the dull ache of adrenaline in my temples. Each step was deliberate and cautious, as though any sudden movement might provoke whatever lingered there. The dust swirling in the beams of my flashlight reminded me of tiny insects, dancing in the gloom, mocking me with their formlessness. When I arrived at the staircase, my phone vibrated. The abrupt sensation in my pocket almost made me cry out. Glancing at the screen, I saw a message from my supervisor, asking if everything was okay, because I had been gone longer than expected. The rational part of me wanted to respond that I was finishing up, that I was on my way out. But my throat felt too dry even to swallow, and my hands shook so violently that I nearly dropped the phone. As I descended each flight of stairs, the sense of something trailing behind me only grew. Occasionally, I risked a quick glance over my shoulder, guided by a primal compulsion to see if something was following me in the gloom. Yet each time, I was confronted with emptiness. Still, that emptiness felt occupied. I was no stranger to illusions born of fear, but this was different. The building seemed alive with it, pressing in from every shadow. Reaching the ground floor was almost a relief, but the tension didn't dissipate. The main entrance loomed ahead, the heavy metal doors I'd entered through now seeming impossibly distant. My flashlight flickered once, causing me to stagger. I was terrified the battery would die, leaving me in darkness. Fortunately, it held on. When I finally stepped onto the cracked asphalt outside, I felt the cool night air wash over me like an exorcism. Yet the sense of foreboding didn't lift entirely. I was out, but the invisible presence of that place clung to me. Before leaving, I forced myself to turn around for one last look at the building. It rose from the ground like a monolith of silent malevolence. High above, one of the dirty windows on the top floor flashed again, a single pulse of light that vanished almost instantly. My stomach lurched. It couldn't have been a trick of my own flashlight. nor a reflection of passing headlights. It was contained within that window, a brief, mocking signal, a reminder of whatever I had left behind in there. I climbed into my van, slammed the door, and tried to collect myself. The engine roared to life with a comforting rumble, but my hands were so slick with sweat that they slipped on the steering wheel. I glanced at the building one more time as I pulled away, half expecting to see a silhouette at one of the windows, watching me drive off. But there was only darkness, a dense, suffocating darkness that seemed to ripple as it consumed the building's interior. I can't fully explain what happened inside that place. The next day, I filed my report, noting the building's structural hazards and the puzzling flickering lights. I left out the part about the creeping dread, the vivid sensation of someone brushing past my back, the intangible presence that haunted every corridor. My supervisor asked indirectly if I had found any sign of squatters or vandals. I simply shook my head, replying that the building seemed empty. I stayed vague about the details, not wanting to seem irrational, but I still feel that building has claimed a part of me, like it marked me as soon as I walked in. Sometimes in the late hours of the night, I recall the metallic tang in the stairwell and that surge of electricity that illuminated the corridor, even though it should have been impossible. I can't erase the memory of that final flash from the top floor window taunting me. My dreams have been uneasy ever since, filled with echoing hallways and flickering fluorescent lights that blink out just as a faceless figure reaches for me from the shadows. I've tried convincing myself that all of it can be explained away. Shoddy wiring, gusts of air from broken windows, my imagination running wild in an unfamiliar environment. Yet, a nagging conviction remains that there was more to it, something intangible and predatory that wanted me to know it was there, watching my every move, feeding off my fear. Even now, when I pass other abandoned structures, I can't help but glance up at their darkened windows, half terrified, half expectant to see a similar flicker calling me inside. My final realization is this. Sometimes a place can feel so steeped in dread that it warps the boundaries between reality and imagination. In that building, logic unraveled, leaving only raw, primal terror. I escaped physically unharmed, but with a wound in my psyche that still hasn't healed. My eyes linger on dark corners for too long these days, and every time the lights flicker in my own home, I'm thrust back into that suffocating corridor. The presence might still be there, waiting, or maybe it followed me. Either way, I can't shake the uncanny certainty that I was never alone in that place, and that whatever stalked me through those halls still watches from the shadows, biding its time until I dare return.